Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes, the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So, Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground, flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered 2 innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was, Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word "let's" to the word "just." And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the 3-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. He decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. But it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were two police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-O-Lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? In the quiet city of Brandon, Canada, a young woman named Erin Cheney had her whole life ahead of her. She was a kind, energetic person who was loved by her family and her friends. She had big dreams for her future, and she worked hard every day to make those dreams a reality. But, in her personal life, things were not going well. For a while, Erin had been dating a 22-year-old man named Michael Bridges. At first, the relationship seemed normal, but as time went on, Michael began to show a very dark side. He was incredibly possessive, control-oriented, and prone to sudden outbursts of anger. Erin quickly realized that this was not a healthy relationship. She knew she deserved better, and she decided she wanted to end things. In 2001, Erin made up her mind to break up with Michael and start fresh. But shortly after she made that decision, something terrible happened. Erin suddenly vanished. One day, she was going about her normal routine, and the next day, she was completely gone. Her family was plunged into an absolute nightmare. They called her phone over and over again, but it went straight to voicemail. They reached out to all of her friends, but nobody had seen her. There was no goodbye note, no signs that she had planned to run away, and no activity on her bank accounts. She had simply disappeared. Her family went to the police in Brandon, and an active investigation was launched immediately. The detectives started looking into everyone who knew Erin, and naturally, Michael Bridges was at the top of their list. He was the boyfriend she was trying to leave, which gave him a clear motive. The police questioned Michael multiple times, but he claimed he had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance. He told them he was devastated and had no idea where she could be. The investigators searched his apartment and his vehicle, but they could not find a single piece of physical evidence. There were no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, and no forensic links to tie him to a crime. Most importantly, they could not find Erin. Without a body or any solid evidence, the police could not arrest Michael. Months turned into years, and the case grew cold. Erin's family was left in a state of agonizing limbo, wondering every single day what had happened to their daughter, while Michael Bridges simply went on living his life. Fast forward to late 2003. It had been about 2 years since Erin Cheney disappeared, and Michael Bridges was not doing well. He was 22 years old, and his life was spiraling out of control. He was completely broke, struggling to find any kind of steady work, and drowning in debt. To make matters worse, his personal life was in shambles. A recent relationship had ended in a painful breakup, and almost all of his friends had slowly drifted away from him. He spent most of his days sitting alone in his small, run-down apartment in Brandon, feeling angry, sad, and completely isolated. He felt like he was trapped in a hole that he could never climb out of. But then, one day, Michael was browsing the internet and came across a sweepstakes. It was a contest offering a free trip to a professional hockey game. Michael did not usually enter contests, but he figured he had absolutely nothing to lose. So he typed in his information and submitted the entry. He completely forgot about it until a few weeks later when he received a phone call. The voice on the other end told him that he had actually won the grand prize. He was getting a fully paid, all-expenses trip to Calgary, which was a major city about 700 miles away from Brandon. The prize included travel, hotel accommodations, and a ticket to see a major hockey game. Michael could hardly believe his luck. For the first time in years, it felt like something good was actually happening to him. He packed his bags and made the trip to Calgary, feeling a sense of excitement that he had not felt in a very long time. One evening in late 2003, Michael walked into the massive, brightly lit hockey arena in Calgary. He found his seat in the stands, sat down, and looked out at the ice rink. The players were skating around, warming up, and the energy in the stadium was incredible. Michael sat there and thought to himself how amazing it was that he was actually here. He felt like the luckiest guy in the world. He was just about to flag down a vendor to buy himself a beer when a man walked down the steps and sat down in the empty seat right next to him. This man was stocky, had a thick mustache, and was dressed in simple, casual clothes. Before Michael could even say hello, the man turned to him with a massive smile. He looked at Michael and said that he was incredibly excited to be there because he had actually won his ticket in a sweepstakes. Michael's jaw dropped. He looked at the man and said that he had won his ticket the exact same way. The two men immediately burst out laughing, and from that exact moment, they hit it off. The man introduced himself as Brock. As the game got underway, Michael and Brock started talking. They talked about hockey, they talked about their lives, and they joked around like they had been best friends for years. Michael, who had spent the last 2 years feeling completely isolated and friendless, was having the time of his life. It felt amazing to just talk to a regular guy who seemed to really understand him and enjoy his company. The hours flew by, and before they knew it, the game was over. As the crowd began to leave the arena, Brock looked at Michael and asked if he wanted to keep the party going. Brock suggested they head over to a strip club just down the road to grab some drinks. Michael wanted to go, but he was worried about his empty wallet. However, Brock insisted on paying, so Michael quickly agreed. They arrived at the strip club, and as they sat down at the bar, Michael started to notice some very interesting things about his new friend. Brock looked like a very simple, blue-collar guy, but he seemed to have an endless amount of money. He did not hesitate to buy round after round of expensive drinks, and he absolutely refused to let Michael spend a single penny. On top of that, Michael watched as Brock pulled out a massive wad of cash from his pocket. It was a thick stack of bills, and Brock was throwing money around like it was nothing, tipping the bartenders generously and handing cash to the dancers. Michael was completely blown away. He had been struggling just to buy groceries back in Brandon, and here was this guy who was spending money like water without a care in the world. As the night started to wind down, Michael turned to Brock and thanked him for being so incredibly generous. He told Brock that he had the best night of his life, and that he was really dreading having to go back to his boring, broke existence in his hometown of Brandon. But as soon as Michael said the word Brandon, Brock stopped. He looked at Michael with a surprised expression and asked if he had just said Brandon. Michael confirmed that he did. Brock smiled widely and told him that it was an unbelievable coincidence, because he was actually planning to move to Brandon in just a couple of months for a new job. Michael was absolutely ecstatic. He had assumed that this night would be a one-time thing and that he would never see Brock again. But now, they were going to be living in the same city. Brock told Michael that if he helped him find a decent apartment once he moved to Brandon, he would return the favor by helping Michael find some work with his company. Michael looked at the massive stack of cash in Brock's hand, then looked back at Brock's face and agreed immediately. A couple of months later, in early December of 2003, Brock officially moved to Brandon. Michael kept his end of the bargain and helped Brock find a nice apartment in town. True to his word, Brock also helped Michael get some work. He introduced Michael to some people and got him a few odd jobs working for the same company that Brock worked for. But as Michael started doing these jobs, he realized they were very strange. They were not normal, everyday jobs. Brock started giving Michael packages and telling him to deliver them to various locations and people all over Brandon. But every single time Brock handed over a package, he looked Michael in the eye and gave him a very serious warning. He told Michael that he must never, under any circumstances, open the packages or look inside them. Michael was not stupid. He knew that this was highly suspicious. It was very obvious that whatever Brock was involved in was shady, and it was highly likely that it was illegal. He began to suspect that he was delivering drugs or some kind of contraband. At first, Michael was very nervous about taking these jobs. He did not want to get arrested. But then, he thought about the lifestyle Brock lived. He remembered the massive wad of cash Brock had at the strip club in Calgary and how easily Brock threw money around. Michael desperately wanted that kind of financial freedom. He was tired of being poor. So, he decided to push his morals aside. He delivered the first package, and when nothing bad happened and he got paid, he decided to keep going. He followed Brock's rules perfectly. He never looked inside the packages, and he just went along with whatever mysterious business Brock was running. He needed the money, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep it coming. One afternoon in early December, Michael was riding in the passenger seat of Brock's car. They had just grabbed some lunch together, and Brock was driving Michael back to his house. The two of them were chatting and laughing when suddenly Brock's cell phone rang. As soon as Brock answered, Michael noticed a sudden change in his demeanor. Brock's voice became very quiet, respectful, and almost tense. Michael realized immediately that Brock was speaking to his boss. Michael sat quietly, trying not to make any noise, but he listened closely to the conversation. Brock was mostly just listening, nodding his head and saying yes. But then Brock's face went completely serious. He looked resigned and told the person on the phone that he would take care of it right now. Then he hung up. Without saying a single word to Michael, Brock suddenly slammed on the brakes, pulled a sharp U-turn in the middle of the street, and started speeding in the opposite direction. Michael was confused, but he did not want to interrupt. A few minutes later, Brock pulled the car into the parking lot of the City Hotel, which was a well-known local motel. Before Michael could ask what they were doing there, Brock turned to him with a very stern look. He told Michael to stay in the car and not get out. Brock opened his door, stepped out, and marched directly toward one of the motel rooms. Michael watched through the passenger window, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He saw Brock stand in front of the motel door and begin to bang on it violently. A few seconds later, the door opened. A woman was standing inside the room. From Michael's perspective, she looked completely shocked and terrified to see Brock. She immediately tried to slam the door shut, but Brock was too fast and too strong. He shoved his weight against the door, pushing it wide open. The two of them started screaming at each other. Michael could not hear the words through the closed car windows, but it was clear that they were having a massive, vicious argument. Michael started looking around the parking lot, feeling incredibly anxious. He was terrified that someone was going to walk by, see this fight, and call the cops, which would ruin everything. He looked back at the doorway, just in time to see Brock raise his fist and punch the woman directly in the face. The blow was incredibly powerful, and the woman instantly crumpled to the floor. Michael gasped, frozen in absolute shock. But Brock was not done. He climbed on top of the woman as she lay on the floor and began punching her repeatedly in the face, over and over again. Michael watched in horror as blood started splattering across the woman's face. After what felt like an eternity, Brock finally stopped. He stood up, completely calm and unfazed. He slammed the motel room door shut, walked slowly back to the car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. He put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. He did not say a word. He just drove. The entire drive back to Michael's house was filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. Michael sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his mind racing. He was completely terrified. Up until this point, he had convinced himself that delivering those packages was just a minor, victimless crime. He had assumed that whatever organization Brock worked for was just involved in some low-level smuggling. But now, he had just witnessed a brutal, bloody assault. He realized that these people were incredibly dangerous and completely ruthless. He was terrified of the organization, but he was also terrified of Brock. He realized that the man sitting next to him was a monster who could snap at any moment. When they finally pulled up to Michael's house, Brock stopped the car. He turned his head, looked Michael directly in the eyes, and spoke in a cold, flat voice. He told Michael that he must never tell anyone what he had seen today. Michael, wanting nothing more than to get out of that car, nodded quickly. He told Brock that he would not say a word, and that he could trust him. Brock just nodded back. Michael opened the door, got out, and ran inside his house as fast as he could. He locked the door behind him, his hands shaking. He spent the next several days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every little sound, wondering if the police were going to show up at his door, or worse, if Brock was going to come back to silence him. About a week later, Michael was sitting in his living room when his phone started ringing. He looked at the screen and saw Brock's name on the caller ID. Michael's heart sank. Every instinct in his body told him not to answer, to just let it ring. But he knew that ignoring a guy like Brock was an incredibly dangerous move. If Brock thought Michael was pulling away or becoming a liability, Michael might end up just like that woman at the motel. So, with a shaking hand, he picked up the phone. Brock did not bother with any friendly small talk. He went straight to the point. He told Michael that he had another delivery package ready, and he asked if Michael was still committed to the job. Michael stood there, his mind spinning. The rational part of his brain told him to refuse, to get as far away from Brock and this criminal underworld as possible. But he was terrified of what Brock would do if he said no. And on top of that, Michael was still completely broke. He needed the money. He felt like he was already in too deep anyway, so he made the conscious decision to just keep going. He told Brock that yes, he was still committed and he would do the delivery. Brock sounded pleased. He told Michael that he was making the right choice, and then he added that he and his boss were actually very impressed with Michael's silence and loyalty over the past week. Then, he hung up. Michael let out a deep breath. He grabbed his keys and headed out to do the delivery, feeling like he had just signed away his soul. Over the next 2 months, things seemed to settle back into a normal routine. Michael continued to deliver packages, and he and Brock continued to meet up for meals. But Michael was always on edge, knowing the violent reality of the people he was working for. Then, in early February of 2004, Michael and Brock were sitting in a local diner in Brandon eating lunch. Michael noticed right away that Brock was acting very strange. He was extremely fidgety, tapping his fingers on the table and looking around the diner. Michael asked him if everything was okay. Brock suddenly stopped fidgeting, looked at Michael, and smiled. He told Michael that things were actually better than okay. He said he had an offer for Michael that could potentially change his life forever. Brock explained that he and the boss had been watching Michael very closely over the last few months. He said they were incredibly impressed by how Michael had handled himself. He had delivered every package on time, he had never pried into their business, and most importantly, he had kept his mouth completely shut about the brutal beating at the city hotel. Brock told him that this proved Michael was a rare breed of person. He was highly dependable, completely loyal, and knew how to keep a secret. Because of this, Brock said he wanted to introduce Michael to the boss. He explained that if the boss liked him, Michael could get a massive promotion. He would be moved out of the low-level delivery position and into a high-level managerial role, just like the one Brock had. He would be given serious responsibility, but he would also start making an unbelievable amount of money. Michael sat there, listening to this, and his heart started pounding. He felt a mix of intense excitement and terrifying nervousness. On one hand, he wanted that money more than anything. He was tired of living in poverty. He had spent months working with Brock, and he had slowly become desensitized to the danger and the violence. He realized that he was willing to throw his morals out the window if it meant he would never have to worry about money again. But on the other hand, he was terrified of meeting the boss. He knew that this boss was a highly dangerous, powerful criminal who did not hesitate to order brutal acts of violence. If Michael did anything to upset him, the consequences would be lethal. But before Michael could say anything, Brock leaned across the table. He told Michael that before he could actually take him to meet the boss, there was one more thing. Michael had to pass a final test. Brock explained that the boss did not just hire anyone for high-level roles. Michael had to prove that he was not just a quiet delivery boy. He had to prove that he was truly cutthroat, brutal, and capable of doing whatever it took to get a job done. He needed to show that he had ice in his veins, just like Brock did. Brock leaned back in his seat and just stared at Michael, waiting for his response. Michael sat in silence, his mind working frantically. He did not know what to say. He wondered if Brock was about to hand him a weapon and tell him to go hurt someone. He wondered if he was going to have to commit a violent crime right then and there to prove himself. But as he sat there panicking, Michael suddenly had an epiphany. He realized that he did not need to go out and commit a new crime. He did not need to wait for Brock to give him a test. He already had the ultimate proof. He had a secret from his past that was so dark, so cold-blooded, and so terrible that it would instantly prove to Brock and the boss that he was a ruthless killer who could handle anything. He looked Brock right in the eye, took a deep breath, and decided to tell him his deepest secret. Michael leaned forward and began to speak. He told Brock about his ex-girlfriend, Erin Cheney. He explained that 2 years earlier, back in 2001, Erin had tried to break up with him. He told Brock that he was so incredibly angry that he simply could not let her leave him. He described how he had cornered her, grabbed her by the neck, and squeezed her throat until she passed out. He then explained how he dragged her unconscious body into the bathroom, filled the bathtub with water, and held her head face down under the water until she drowned. He told Brock that after she was dead, he wrapped her body up, put her in his car, and drove far out of town to a remote, secluded area where he dumped her body. Michael boasted about how he had completely gotten away with it. He said the police had suspected him, but they could never find any evidence, and they had never found her body. He told the story with a sense of pride and confidence, believing that this would make him look like a total professional in Brock's eyes. As Michael spoke, Brock's eyes went incredibly wide. He sat there, listening to every single detail of the horrific crime. When Michael finally finished, Brock took a deep breath, looked at him, and told him that he was definitely ready. He said they were going to go meet the boss. A few days later, Michael arrived at a luxury hotel in a nearby city to meet the boss. He met Brock in the lobby, and they went up to a beautiful suite. But the room was empty. As Michael waited, sweating with nerves, Brock suggested they do a quick dry run of the story to make sure he was ready. Michael eagerly agreed and repeated every detail of how he had killed Erin Cheney. Just as he finished, there was a loud knock. Brock opened the door, and instead of a criminal boss, a team of police officers rushed in and arrested Michael. He was stunned to find out his entire new life was a lie. Brock was an undercover cop, and the criminal organization was completely fake. The sweepstakes, the packages, and the seedy hotel beating were all part of an elaborate Mr. Big sting operation set up by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to catch him. With his recorded confession, investigators finally knew the exact truth. 2 years prior, Erin Cheney had tried to end their relationship. In a fit of possessive rage, Michael strangled her in his apartment, dragged her to the bathroom, and held her head under water in the tub until she drowned. He then drove her body to a remote area and dumped it. Using his detailed confession, police recovered her remains, giving her grieving family the closure they desperately deserved. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. This tragic case left a deep scar, showing how far a monster would go to hide his crimes. Thanks for watching. For months, Michael believed he was climbing deeper into a dangerous criminal organization. In reality, every step was leading him straight into a trap. And the moment he finally told the truth, his life was over. See you in the next story. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit, because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. He began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt and the cave was very damp and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously. Her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave. He can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors, but in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. Always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little bit after she had died. So truthfully, it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete and total understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this whole area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever else told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside his door was a very firm good night, which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild for him. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his police cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself. He picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground. And at the same time, he was sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, the officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house. He had his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a fresh glass of whiskey sitting in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house that he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreen trees, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods all around him were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also down near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and had left when they were told to. Which meant that Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, the officials had not physically attempted to force him out of his home, but now that Harry saw them all assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home, just because the government told him to, had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right this is my home. They're going to have to come and get me. No authority could take me out of here. No authority dare." And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya. We often like to think that we have a pretty good grasp on how the world works. We wake up in the morning, we go about our daily routines, and we assume that the boundaries of reality are solid and predictable. We go to the grocery store, we travel for work, we hang out with our families, and we watch television, expecting that everything will make perfect sense. But every once in a while, something happens that completely shatters that illusion. The solid ground beneath our feet suddenly feels incredibly fragile, and we are forced to confront events that seem like they were pulled straight out of a fictional thriller. The truth is that reality is often far more bizarre, terrifying, and mysterious than anything a writer could ever dream up. Today, we are going to dive into 5 strange but true stories that defy logical explanation. These are stories of chilling encounters in broad daylight, survival against absolute physical impossibility, warnings from places beyond our understanding, cruel psychological experiments carried out in secret, and a monstrous evil that managed to hide in plain sight on national television. To start, we have to travel back to February 17th of the year 2004. It was a cold afternoon in Wakachi City, Japan. Inside a massive, bustling superstore called Jusco, hundreds of shoppers were going about their normal routines. The air was filled with the typical sounds of a busy retail environment. You had the hum of fluorescent lights, the beep of cash registers, the murmurs of families discussing what to buy for dinner, and the gentle clatter of shopping carts. But suddenly, this peaceful, mundane atmosphere was completely shattered by a loud and aggressive commotion coming from the front of the store near a row of automated teller machines. When nearby shoppers stopped what they were doing and rushed over to see what was going on, they were met with a deeply unsettling sight. There was a thin young woman with a tiny baby strapped tightly to her chest, and she was locked in a violent, desperate struggle with an older man. At first, the onlookers just stood there in absolute shock. They did not know what to make of this. It was a chaotic scene, and they were trying to process who was the aggressor and who was the victim. But then the young woman raised her voice and yelled out the word thief. The man she was grappling with was 68 years old, and he was clearly in a state of intense distress. He was a retiree, and in this moment he had been pinned up against a bank of ATMs by the sheer force of the struggle. His hands were clenched into tight defensive fists, as if he was desperately holding on to whatever it was he had supposedly taken from the woman. Seeing a young mother with an infant in danger, 3 men from the gathering crowd decided they had to intervene. They lunged forward, grabbed the older man, and wrestled him away from the woman, pinning him face down onto the hard floor. Even though he was outnumbered and held down, the older man refused to open his hands. The 3 bystanders began screaming for the police, who happened to be patrolling nearby in the shopping center. The officers ran over, immediately jumped on top of the older man, and forced handcuffs onto his wrists. All the while, the man was lying on the ground, crying out and pleading with them, saying over and over that he had done absolutely nothing wrong. But then, his voice changed. Onlookers would later report that he began making a series of very strange, guttural moaning sounds. Before anyone could figure out what was happening to him, the man began violently vomiting, and within seconds, his body went completely limp as he lost consciousness. An ambulance was called, and while the police officers were waiting for emergency services to arrive, they decided to pry open the unconscious man's clenched fist to see what he had stolen. But when they finally managed to force his fingers open, they did not find a stolen wallet or a wad of cash. The only thing he was clutching was his own bank card, which was now severely bent in 3 different places from the force of his grip. The police searched his pockets and found his wallet, which belonged entirely to him. They also looked through the shopping bags that were scattered on the floor around him, but those bags only contained basic pet supplies, specifically some hamster food that he had just purchased. There was absolutely no evidence that this man had taken anything from anyone. At this point, the police realized they needed to speak to the victim to find out what had actually happened. They looked up from the unconscious man on the floor and began scanning the crowd of onlookers for the young woman with the baby. But she was gone. In the chaos of the struggle, the arresting officers, the bystanders, and the crowd had been so focused on subduing the older man that nobody had kept an eye on her. The police asked the crowd if anyone knew who she was or which way she had gone, but everyone just shook their heads. Nobody had paid attention to her departure. The police officers thought it was certainly a bit strange that a victim of a robbery would just walk away without waiting to speak to law enforcement, but they figured she was probably just shaken up and wanted to get her baby out of a stressful situation. Since she was gone and the suspect was unconscious, they decided to classify the whole incident as an attempted robbery and essentially put it to the side for the moment. But the situation grew far more serious the very next day. While still in the hospital, the 68-year-old retiree died. The medical examiners determined that his cause of death was heart failure, which had been brought on by the extreme physical and psychological stress of the altercation and the subsequent arrest. When the police received this report, they simply updated the case file to reflect that the suspect had passed away, and they prepared to close the investigation permanently. However, the family of the deceased man, who was referred to in police reports as Mr. A, completely refused to accept this outcome. They were devastated, and they knew in their hearts that Mr. A would never have attacked a young woman, let alone a mother with a baby. He was a gentle, quiet retiree who had spent 40 years of his life working dedicatedly for a chemical manufacturing company. He was currently collecting a modest pension and worked part-time as a security guard just to keep himself busy. He lived a peaceful life with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren in a house located just about a kilometer away from the Jusco store. On the afternoon of his death, he had walked to the store for the sole purpose of buying food for his grandson's pet hamster. His family went to the police and begged them to reopen the case. They insisted that Mr. A was not a criminal and that the mysterious woman must have done something to provoke him or start the fight. The police initially brushed them off, but the family was so persistent that the department finally agreed to a compromise. They said they would review the store's closed-circuit television security footage from that afternoon just to make sure they had not missed any crucial details. And when the investigators sat down to watch that footage, what they saw completely terrified them. The security camera was positioned directly over the row of ATMs where the entire struggle had taken place. The footage showed that about 5 minutes before Mr. A even entered the frame, the young woman with the baby was already standing there. But she was not waiting in line, and she was not using an ATM. She was standing tucked away in a dark corner just off to the side, completely motionless. Her back was pressed against the wall, her head was tilted downward, and she was holding her baby strapped to her chest. She stood there like a statue, never moving a muscle, just staring at the ground. Then Mr. A walked into the frame. He carried several shopping bags on his arms. He walked up to one of the ATMs, inserted his card, withdrew some cash, and turned around to walk toward the exit. The moment his back was turned, the woman in the corner suddenly came to life. It was as if a switch had been flipped. She lifted her head, stepped out of the shadow, and walked directly toward Mr. A. As she passed him, she deliberately reached out and brushed her hand against his chest in a very swift, gliding motion. The footage showed that Mr. A had an immediate, instinctive reaction to being touched by her. He spun around and grabbed her arm, clearly trying to stop her or ask what she was doing. And that was the exact moment the struggle began, and she started screaming that he was a thief. It was absolutely clear from the security tape that Mr. A had not tried to rob anyone. He was completely innocent. The woman had set a trap for him, waiting in the dark corner for the perfect target, and had fabricated the entire robbery out of thin air. As the video continued, the investigators watched the 3 bystanders tackle Mr. A to the ground. They watched the police arrive and handcuff him. And then they focused their attention on the woman. During the absolute chaos of the arrest, while everyone's eyes were glued to the dying man on the floor, the woman simply stood up, adjusted the baby on her chest, and calmly walked into the crowd, blending in and disappearing. The police immediately launched a massive search through all the security footage from every single camera in and around the Jusko Superstore. They looked at the entrance cameras, the exit cameras, the parking lot cameras, and the street-level cameras. They analyzed hours of tape from before and after the incident. But they found absolutely nothing. There was not a single frame of footage showing this woman entering the store, nor was there any footage of her leaving. It was as if she had simply materialized in that dark corner next to the ATMs, waited for Mr. A, caused his death, and then vanished into thin air. To make matters even more frustrating, the police interviewed dozens of witnesses who had been standing just feet away from the struggle, but not a single one of them could provide a detailed or reliable description of the woman's face. It was as if their minds had completely blocked it out, or they had simply been too distracted by the violence of the struggle to register her features. But the investigators did not give up. They went back to the ATM camera footage and began playing it frame by frame, zooming in as much as possible. And after hours of painstaking analysis, they found one single second where the woman had looked directly up right into the lens of the security camera, exposing her face. But when the investigators saw her face on the screen, they were so deeply unsettled that they made a highly unusual decision. They decided to hide the image from the public. They did not release it to the media, and they did not show it to anyone outside the department for an entire year. They were genuinely concerned that if the citizens of Wakachi City saw this photograph, it would create widespread panic, and people would be too terrified to ever shop at the Jusko store again. When the image was finally released a year later, the public understood why the police had been so hesitant. The woman's face was completely devoid of any human emotion. Her eyes were blank, hollow, and downcast, staring out with a chilling coldness. There was no anger, no fear, and no excitement on her face. Many people who saw the image compared it to a death mask, which is a plaster cast made of a dead person's face shortly after their passing. Others remarked that she did not even look like a living human being, but rather something artificial or ghostly. After seeing the footage and realizing that their loved one had been entirely innocent, Mr. A's family filed a lawsuit against the police department for their negligence in detaining and pinning him to the ground while he was clearly experiencing a fatal medical emergency. The family and the department eventually reached an out-of-court settlement, but money was never what the family truly wanted. They wanted answers. They wanted to know who this woman was, why she had targeted Mr. A, and what she had done to him to cause his sudden, violent death. But despite the wide release of the creepy photograph, no one ever came forward with any information. The woman with the baby was never identified. And now, she never will be. The statute of limitations for the case officially expired in the year 2011. Today, the mystery of the Jusco Phantom remains one of the most famous and unsettling unsolved cases in modern Japanese history. It is still debated in online forums where people share the eerie photograph and wonder what kind of force was standing in that dark corner on that cold afternoon in 2004. Now, we shift our focus to an entirely different kind of mystery, one that took place high in the sky over New South Wales, Australia in the year 2007. 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was not your average athlete. She was a member of the German national paragliding team, and she was widely considered to be the absolute best female paraglider on the planet. Over the previous 2 years, she had competed in 10 of the world's most prestigious paragliding competitions, and she had walked away with the gold in 6 of them. She was incredibly driven, highly skilled, and determined to keep her title as the world champion. On the 24th of February 2007, Eva was on Mount Bora in Australia, preparing her high-tech paragliding gear. She was joined by about 200 other paragliders from all over the world. This was Eva's very last chance to get a training flight in before her first major high-stakes competition of the season, which was scheduled to begin the following week. She was completely focused and eager to get into the air. But as the pilots were lining up and checking their equipment, one of the event coaches walked out in front of the crowd to deliver a warning. He told them that a line of storm clouds had been spotted far to the north. However, the weather forecast for the area was highly ambiguous. The meteorologists could not tell if the storm was going to move directly over Mount Bora or if it would pass safely to the side. The coach told the pilots that the decision to launch was entirely up to them. They had to weigh the risks for themselves. Eva looked up at the sky. It was turning a heavy, dark shade of gray, but she decided that she could not afford to miss this training opportunity. She figured that if the weather started to look truly dangerous once she was in the air, she would simply cut her flight short and land safely in the fields below. The rest of her German teammates, however, were not willing to take that chance. They decided to stay grounded and monitor her progress from a chase fan on the road. Because Eva took a little extra time to double-check her harness and her instruments, by the time she was ready to step up to the edge of the cliff, almost everyone else had already launched. She was one of only a few pilots left on the mountain. She strapped herself into her glider, took a powerful, determined run forward, and launched herself off the cliff, soaring gracefully into the sky. Down on the ground, her teammates tracked her path using GPS and kept in touch with her via a two-way radio. For the first part of her flight, everything was incredibly peaceful. The air was smooth, and Eva navigated along the rugged ridgeline of Mount Bora for about 12 miles. But as the ridge ended and she sailed out over the vast, flat Australian savanna, the situation took a sudden and terrifying turn. 2 massive thunderstorm clouds had rapidly developed directly in her flight path. One of the clouds was significantly larger than the other. The vast majority of the paragliders who had launched earlier in the day had already passed through this area before the clouds formed, so they were safe. But Eva and 2 other pilots, one from the Austrian team and one from the Chinese team, were now flying straight toward the danger. They had to make a choice. They could either land immediately in the rough, unpredictable terrain of the savanna, or they could try to navigate around the perimeter of the clouds. They chose to try and dodge them. They knew it was incredibly dangerous to fly anywhere near the bottom of these clouds because of a phenomenon known as an updraft. At the onset of a major storm, a massive column of warm air is sucked violently from the ground up into the atmosphere, feeding the clouds. If a paraglider gets caught in that column, they can be pulled upward like a leaf in a vacuum cleaner. So Ava and the other two pilots began flying aggressively away from the dark clouds, trying to find a clear path. But the storm was moving far faster than they could have anticipated. In a matter of seconds, the larger cloud overtook the smaller one, combining to form a massive 12-mile-wide cumulonimbus cloud. Suddenly, all three pilots were trapped inside the storm zone. The updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is legendary among aviators for its sheer destructive power. It can easily tear aircraft apart, and it can last for over an hour. The Austrian pilot immediately realized the danger. He pulled down hard on one of his steering toggles, pointed his feet downward, and began a tight, aggressive spiral to force his glider down to the earth, successfully escaping the grasp of the rising air. As he was spiraling down, he looked back to check on the other two. He could not see the Chinese pilot, but he saw Ava. She was desperately trying to mimic his spiraling maneuver, but it was too late. She was already caught in the core of the updraft. The Austrian pilot watched in horror as Ava was pulled straight up, disappearing into the pitch-black heart of the cloud. By the time the Austrian pilot slammed into the ground, a ferocious storm had broken loose. Giant hailstones were pelting the earth around him. He scrambled for shelter in a nearby barn, pulled out his radio, and screamed to the ground crews that they had an extreme emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was experiencing a nightmare. She was being hurled upward at an unbelievable speed of 60 feet per second. The wind was so loud and violent that it felt like she was standing next to a jet engine. She was completely blind, surrounded by absolute darkness, except for the blinding flashes of lightning that exploded mere feet away from her glider. She knew she was being dragged into the very center of the storm's eye. She managed to squeeze her radio button and send a desperate message to her team on the ground. She gasped out that she could not see anything, and then her radio went completely dead. As she rose higher and higher, the temperature plummeted, and she was pelted by hailstones the size of oranges. The pain was excruciating, and she fought with every ounce of her strength to keep her glider stable. But at those extreme heights, the air becomes incredibly thin. Soon, Ava began to suffer from hypoxia, a severe lack of oxygen to the brain. She could no longer think clearly, her vision faded, and she passed out. The updraft did not stop. It shot her unconscious body all the way up and out of the very top of the storm cloud. While she was finally out of the turbulent, wet air of the storm, she was now floating in an environment that was 50 degrees below zero. Almost instantly, everything on her body froze solid. Her face, her insulated gloves, her clothing, and the delicate fabric lines of her paraglider were covered in a thick layer of ice. At that altitude, there was virtually no oxygen to breathe, and she had no mask or tank. By every known law of human physiology, Ava Wisniewska should have died within minutes. Yet, she did not. Her heart kept beating, and she remained unconscious, floating helplessly above the storm for 45 long minutes. Then, the weight of the ice on her glider caused one side of the wing to collapse. Suddenly, Ava was sent into a violent, uncontrolled freefall. She was hurtling back down toward the earth at a speed of 90 feet per second, falling straight through the frozen, turbulent storm cloud for a second time. But, as she cleared the bottom of the cloud and entered warmer, denser air, a miracle occurred. The ice on her glider melted, and the rush of air caused the canopy to naturally inflate and open back up. The violent, jerking motion of the glider suddenly stopping her terminal velocity jolted Ava back to consciousness. She opened her eyes, completely disoriented and shivering uncontrollably. She was still high in the air, but she was below the storm. The updraft had finally dissipated. Weakly, she reached up, grabbed her steering toggles, and guided her frozen glider down to a rough crash landing in a grassy field. She curled her freezing body into a tight ball, reached for her radio, and called her team. When they heard her voice, they began to cry. they had been preparing themselves for the worst. The Chinese pilot who had been sucked into the storm with her had unfortunately been struck by lightning and killed. They had assumed Ava had met the same fate. Ava was rushed to the hospital where doctors braced themselves for severe injuries. But to their absolute astonishment, they found that she had survived almost completely unscathed. She had some deep bruises from the giant hailstones and some moderate frostbite on her face and ears, but she required no major surgeries. She was actually discharged from the hospital that very same day. Later, Ava and her teammates went back to the launch site to retrieve her equipment. They decided to plug her GPS tracking unit into a computer to see just how high the storm had carried her. When the data loaded onto the screen, the team stared at it in complete, stunned silence. The GPS log showed that Ava had reached a peak altitude of 32,634 feet. To put that into perspective, that is the exact cruising altitude of a commercial passenger jet. Ava had been floating in the open air, unprotected, at an altitude higher than the summit of Mount Everest, and she had lived to tell the story. Our third story takes us back to the early morning hours of the 10th of June, 1994, in the mountainous terrain of Northern California. A woman named Deborah Hoy was fast asleep in a guest bedroom at her relative's house in Sacramento. She and her husband had planned a lovely, relaxing, multi-day visit with their family. But at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Deborah suddenly jolted awake. She did not know why she was awake, but she was immediately gripped by an intense, overwhelming sense of panic. It was not a physical pain, but rather a psychological urgency, a deep, unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong and that they had to leave the house immediately and drive back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Deborah turned to her husband and shook him awake. She explained the feeling, her voice trembling with anxiety. Her husband, who was exhausted, tried his best to reassure her. He told her that she had probably just had a vivid nightmare and that she was still half asleep. He urged her to close her eyes and try to go back to sleep, promising that if she still felt the same way in the morning, they would pack up and leave first thing. Deborah nodded and laid back down, but as she stared at the dark ceiling, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, a voice in her head screaming at her that they had to get on the road right that second. Finally, she could not take it anymore. She jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and told her husband that they were leaving right now. Seeing that his wife was genuinely terrified, her husband reluctantly agreed to go. They quietly packed their suitcases, wrote a hasty note of apology to their relatives, slipped out the front door, and got into their car. The drive from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe requires navigating a notorious stretch of highway up in the mountains. One of the most dangerous parts of this route is a section known as Ballen Bend. It is an incredibly winding, narrow road with sharp, blind turns, flanked on one side by a towering rock wall and on the other by a sheer, steep drop-off down the side of the mountain. One wrong move or a moment of distraction, and a car would plummet into the deep ravine below. They had been driving through the pitch-black mountain air for about 15 minutes, with only their headlights cutting through the darkness, when they rounded a particularly sharp horseshoe bend. As the headlights swept across the right side of the road, Deborah, who was looking out the passenger window, spotted something lying on the shoulder of the highway just a few feet past the asphalt. At first, she thought it was just some discarded trash, a sleeping bag, or perhaps a dead animal that had been hit by a truck. But as their car drew closer, the headlights fully illuminated the object. Deborah gasped in horror. Lying there on the cold, dirty gravel was the body of a young woman. She was completely naked, lying on her side, and appeared to be totally motionless. Deborah turned to her husband and screamed for him to keep driving. Her husband, who had also caught a brief glimpse of the figure, was panicked. He asked if they should stop, if they should turn around and see if she was alive and needed help. But Deborah was absolutely hysterical. She was convinced that the body was a trap, a setup by some violent criminal hiding in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting driver to stop so they could rob or kill them. She pleaded with her husband to just keep driving and find the nearest phone. Luckily, just a quarter of a mile down the road, they came across a forest ranger station. In the parking lot, there was a public payphone. They pulled in, and Deborah, her hands shaking, dialed the police. She explained exactly what she had seen on the shoulder of Ballen Bend. The dispatcher told them to stay put at the ranger station and wait for responding officers to arrive. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. The officers listened to Deborah's story and then asked her husband to lead the way back up the mountain, stopping a safe distance before the sharp bend so they could investigate. The couple got back into their car, with the police cruiser following close behind. They drove back up the winding road, and as they approached the horseshoe turn, her husband pulled over onto the shoulder. The officers parked behind them, got out of their cruiser, and walked past the couple's car, disappearing around the bend with their high-powered flashlights. Deborah and her husband sat in their car, watching the beams of light sweep across the dark trees and the side of the road. But after several minutes, the officers walked back around the bend, their faces looking completely blank. They walked up to Deborah's window, and one of them told her that they had searched the entire area, but there was absolutely nothing there. There was no body, no clothes, no trash, and no signs of anyone having been on the shoulder. Deborah was stunned. She insisted that she was not crazy and that she knew exactly what she had seen. The officers were polite, but they told her that since there was no evidence of a crime, they had to clear the scene. They advised the couple to continue their drive home and try to get some rest. The officers drove back to their precinct, and as they were sitting in the break room discussing the strange call, another officer named Rich Strayer walked in. Rich was a veteran of the department, and when he heard them mention the name Ballen Bend, his ears immediately perked up. Rich knew that just a few days prior, a young mother named Christine Skubish and her 3-year-old son Nicky had been reported missing. They had been driving to a family member's house, and the last known tower ping from Christine's cell phone had placed her somewhere near Ballen Bend. Rich wondered if the woman Deborah had seen could have been Christine. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, Rich got into his patrol car and drove out to Ballen Bend. He pulled over at the exact spot Deborah had described and began a foot search. Within minutes of walking along the shoulder, he spotted something small lying near the guardrail. He walked over and picked it up. It was a child's shoe. Rich felt a knot form in his stomach. He walked to the edge of the guardrail and looked down the steep, vertical embankment. At first, all he could see was a dense canopy of pine trees and thick brush. But as he adjusted his eyes, he noticed a faint trail of broken branches and trampled leaves leading down into the ravine. And then he saw a glint of red metal far below. Rich scrambled over the guardrail and began a treacherous climb down the steep mountain slope. He tore through the thick brush, following the path of destruction, until he finally reached a small, flat clearing near the bottom of the ravine. There, crushed and battered by the trees, was a red 4-door sedan. It was the exact car Christine Skubish had been driving. Rich ran to the driver's side and looked through the shattered window. Inside the driver's seat was Christine, and it was immediately clear that she was deceased. Rich then looked over into the passenger seat, and his heart stopped. There, strapped into his car seat, was 3-year-old Nicky. He was pale, incredibly thin, and barely breathing, but his eyes were open. He was alive. He had survived for 5 days in the freezing mountain temperatures without food or water. Rich quickly pulled him from the wreckage, carried him up the mountain, and called for an emergency medical helicopter. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save the little boy. They later told Rich that if he had found Nicky even 1 or 2 hours later, the boy would have succumbed to severe dehydration and exposure. He had been found at the absolute last possible second. When the investigators began reconstructing the accident, they assumed that Christine had fallen asleep at the wheel, run off the road, and crashed down the embankment. They figured that at some point she must have survived the initial impact, crawled up the steep slope to the road, and laid down on the shoulder to seek help, which was when Deborah had spotted her. They believed she must have then crawled back down to the car to be with her son before she died. But when the coroner completed the autopsy on Christine, that theory was completely destroyed. The medical examiner proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Christine had died instantly from massive head trauma the exact moment the car hit the trees, 5 days before Deborah and her husband had driven down that road. She could not have climbed up to the road, and she could not have been the woman Deborah saw lying on the shoulder. To this day, there is no logical explanation for what Deborah Hoy saw on that dark mountain road. The police searched the area thoroughly and confirmed no other people or bodies were present. Yet, it was Deborah's highly specific police report that led Officer Rich Strayer to search the exact spot where little Nikki was dying in the ravine. Many believe that some supernatural force, perhaps a maternal instinct that transcended death itself, had manifested on the road to guide rescuers to the dying child. Now we move to a story that began in 1980, involving a young man named Bobby Shafron. Bobby was 19 years old, and he was on his way to Sullivan County Community College, located about 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his very first semester of college. Bobby was incredibly nervous. He was a shy, quiet kid who had never been popular in high school, and he did not know a single person at this new school. As he pulled his car into the campus parking lot, he saw hundreds of students laughing, hugging, and carrying boxes into the dorm buildings. He felt a deep sense of isolation. He grabbed his backpack, took a deep breath, and began walking across the wide campus lawn toward his dorm. But as he walked, Bobby noticed something very strange. Every time he passed a group of students, they would stop talking and just stare at him. Some of them smiled warmly, and others began waving. Bobby figured they were just being exceptionally friendly to freshmen, so he smiled back. But then a young woman ran directly up to him, threw her arms around his neck, kissed him on the cheek, and told him she was so happy he was back. Bobby was completely confused. He gently pushed her away and told her that she must have the wrong person because he had never been to this school before. The girl laughed, rolled her eyes as if he was playing a joke, and walked away. Bobby continued into the dorm building, but the bizarre interactions only intensified. As he walked down the hallway, random guys were high-fiving him, patting him on the back, and welcoming him back for the year. Finally, as he was about to turn the corner toward his assigned room, a voice boomed down the hallway behind him, calling out the name Eddie. Bobby stopped and turned around. At the far end of the hall, a student was waving excitedly, yelling for Eddie to come over. Bobby walked up to the student and explained that his name was not Eddie, that he was a freshman named Bobby, and that there had clearly been some sort of massive misunderstanding. The student stared at him for a second, laughed, and told him that he was a funny guy before walking off. Bobby went into his room, shut the heavy door, and sat on his bed, feeling completely overwhelmed and deeply unsettled. He could not understand why an entire campus of strangers was convinced he was a guy named Eddie. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on his door. Bobby opened it, expecting another confusing encounter. Standing in the hallway was a student he had never seen before. But the moment this student saw Bobby's face, all the color drained from his skin. The student began visibly shaking. He stared at Bobby for a long, silent moment and then asked him if he had been adopted. Bobby, taken aback by the highly personal question, said that yes, he had been adopted as a baby. The student then asked if his birthday was the 12th of July, 1961. Bobby's jaw dropped. He said yes. The student, whose name was Michael, grabbed Bobby by the shoulders. He explained that his best friend, a guy named Eddie Galland, had attended the school the previous year but had decided not to return this term. Michael told Bobby that he looked, spoke, walked, and acted exactly like Eddie. He told Bobby that they had to be identical twins. Bobby could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had spent his entire life believing he was an only child. Michael insisted they call Eddie immediately. They ran out to a campus payphone, Michael dialed the number, and when a voice answered, Bobby took the receiver. He introduced himself to Eddie, and as soon as Eddie spoke, Bobby felt a chill run down his spine. The voice coming through the earpiece sounded exactly like his own. Eddie was just as shocked, and he immediately invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house in Long Island. The two boys jumped into Bobby's car and drove for 2 hours through the night. When they arrived at Eddie's suburban neighborhood, they saw a house with every single light turned on, glowing in the darkness. As they walked up the driveway, the front door flew open. Standing in the doorway was Eddie Galland. Bobby and Eddie stared at each other in absolute, breathless silence. They were looking into a living mirror. They had the same hair, the same eyes, the same build, and the same expressions. Michael would later describe the moment as deeply emotional. The two brothers, who had been separated at birth, immediately embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. The story of their incredible chance reunion quickly caught the attention of a local newspaper called Newsday. A reporter was sent to interview the boys, and the paper published a heartwarming, feel-good article about the long-lost twins who had been brought together by pure coincidence. But then, the story took a turn from the highly improbable to the downright impossible. A young man named David Kellman was sitting in his home in Queens, New York, when his friends began calling him in a state of frantic excitement. They told him he needed to go buy a copy of Newsday immediately. They told him that there was an article about two identical twins, and that the photos of the twins looked exactly like David. David was skeptical, but he went down to the local corner store and bought the paper. When he looked at the front page, his heart skipped a beat. The two boys staring back at him were his exact double. But what really caught his eye were their hands. David had always been self-conscious about having unusually large, thick hands, and in the photograph, both Bobby and Eddie had those exact same hands. David read the article and saw that their birthday was the 12th of July, 1961, and that they had been born at the exact same hospital in Long Island where he had been born. He immediately realized that they were not just twins. They were triplets. David managed to get Eddie's phone number and dialed it. Eddie's mother answered the phone, and when David explained who he was, his birthday, and his adoption, she gasps and drops the phone, screaming to her family that they were coming out of the woodwork. A few days later, Bobby and Eddie drove to David's house. The moment all three of them were in the same room, any doubt disappeared. They were identical triplets. Within minutes of meeting, the three 19-year-olds were wrestling on the living room floor, laughing hysterically and talking over one another. It was a beautiful, joyful reunion that made headlines all over the globe. The triplets became instant celebrities. They were invited onto the most popular national talk shows, they were featured on the covers of magazines, and they were hounded by fans wherever they went. People were fascinated by the uncanny similarities between them. Despite being raised by three completely different families in different parts of New York, they all smoked the same brand of cigarettes, they had all competed in wrestling in high school, they all loved the same foods, and they even shared the exact same physical mannerisms and gestures. They decided to move into an apartment together in New York City, and they lived like rock stars. They went to the trendiest clubs, met famous celebrities, and eventually opened an incredibly successful restaurant in Manhattan called Triplets. But while the boys were enjoying their new life, their adoptive parents were growing increasingly angry. They had all adopted their sons through a highly prestigious and wealthy New York agency called Louise Wise Services. None of the parents had ever been told that their baby had brothers, let alone identical triplets. They felt that the agency had deliberately kept them in the dark and stolen their children's right to grow up together. The parents demanded a formal meeting with the executives of Louise Wise Services. When they sat down in the agency's grand conference room, they asked why the triplets had been separated. The executives coldly explained that it was simply too difficult to find a single adoptive home that was willing or able to take in 3 babies at once, so they had made the decision to separate them for their own good. David's father stood up and slammed his fist on the table, telling them that was complete nonsense and that he would have gladly taken all 3 boys if he had only been told the truth. But the agency refused to give any further explanation and abruptly ended the meeting. As the families were walking out of the building, Bobby's father realized he had forgotten his umbrella in the conference room. He turned around, walked back down the quiet hallway, and opened the door. But when he looked inside, he saw the very same executives who had just offered their cold, somber apologies. They had popped open a bottle of expensive champagne and were clinking their glasses together, laughing and celebrating. It was immediately clear to him that they were not sorry at all. They were celebrating having successfully lied to the families and protected some dark secret. The parents tried to hire several prominent law firms to sue the agency, but every single firm they contacted initially showed great excitement, only to call back days later and abruptly back out of the case, claiming a conflict of interest. The parents realized that Louise Wise Services had incredibly powerful, wealthy connections in New York, and that someone was putting pressure on the legal community to keep this secret buried. Eventually, the families hit a brick wall, and they had no choice but to try and move on. But as the years went by, the cracks began to show. The triplets, who had never experienced the normal, slow process of growing up together and learning how to navigate conflicts, began to clash over how to run their restaurant. The arguments became increasingly personal and bitter. Bobby eventually decided he had to walk away from the business, which deeply fractured the trio's bond. Eddie, who suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues, was devastated by the falling out. He desperately wanted his brothers to be close, and the stress of the fracture sent him into a spiral of severe depression. After a brief stay in a psychiatric hospital, Eddie tragically took his own life. It was in the wake of this tragedy that a brilliant investigative journalist named Lawrence Wright began looking into the case. During his research, he stumbled across a highly obscure, dusty scientific paper tucked away in an academic journal. The paper detailed a secret, long-term psychological study involving identical twins and triplets who had been intentionally separated at birth and placed with different families. The paper revealed that all the children in the study had been sourced from the exact same agency, Louise Wise Services. Lawrence contacted Bobby and David and delivered the shocking news. They had not been separated because it was hard to find a home for 3 babies. They had been separated on purpose from the moment they were born to be used as human lab rats in a highly unethical, secret scientific experiment. The study had been designed and run by a prominent New York psychologist named Dr. Peter Neubauer. The goal of the experiment was to solve the age-old scientific debate of nature versus nurture. Dr. Neubauer wanted to see if a person's personality, intelligence, and mental health were determined entirely by their genetics, or if their environment and upbringing could change who they became. To achieve this, the triplets had been deliberately placed into 3 completely different socioeconomic households. Bobby was given to a very wealthy, highly educated family where the father was a doctor. Eddie was placed with a stable, middle-class family where the father was a strict teacher. David was placed with a warm, loving, but low-income immigrant family where English was a second language. Every year of their childhood, researchers from the study would visit each of the boys' homes under the false pretense that they were just conducting routine, standard follow-up visits for the adoption agency. They would film the boys, administer cognitive tests, and take detailed notes on their behavior. The parents had no idea that their sons were being compared to 2 identical brothers living just miles away. Even worse, the researchers had actually used the family's first adopted children as a sort of baseline, studying how the parents raised them before placing the triplets into the homes, essentially turns the parents themselves into unwitting test subjects. When Lawrence Wright tried to interview Dr. Neubauer about the study, the psychologist refused to answer any questions and showed absolutely no remorse. He had never published his final findings, and before his death in 2008, he had ensured that the entire study, including all the video footage and records of the triplets' childhoods, was legally sealed in the archives of Yale University until the year 2066, long after the surviving triplets would be dead. In a recent documentary about the case, Dr. Neubauer's former assistant claimed that the study had proved that nature was far more powerful than nurture, and that the boys were genetically predisposed to their behaviors. But many critics pointed out the ultimate tragedy of the study. Eddie, who had been raised by a cold, strict father, had succumbed to depression and suicide, while his brothers, raised in warmer homes, had survived. This suggested that nurture did indeed play a massive critical role, and that the separation itself had caused irreparable psychological harm to all 3 boys. To this day, Bobby and David have never received a formal apology or a full explanation of what was done to them. The secrets of their lives remain locked away in a university vault, a chilling reminder of how far some are willing to go in the name of science. For our fifth and final story, we go back to a milestone night in American television, the 18th of December, 1956. This was the night that a revolutionary new game show called To Tell the Truth made its very first broadcast. The setup of the show was incredibly engaging. The audience and a panel of 4 celebrity judges would be introduced to 3 contestants, all of whom claimed to be the exact same person. This person was always someone remarkable, someone who had accomplished an extraordinary feat, possessed an unbelievable talent, or lived a highly unusual life. Only one of the 3 contestants was the actual, real person. The other 2 were imposters, coached by the show's producers to lie, manipulate, and trick the judges. The celebrity panel would have a few minutes to ask the contestants questions about their biography to see who would slip up. At the end, the judges would vote on who they believed was telling the truth, and the host would ask the real person to stand up, resulting in massive applause from the studio audience. The show was an absolute sensation, and it remained a staple of American culture for decades. But of all the thousands of episodes that have aired over the years, there is one particular broadcast from October of 1972 that will forever be remembered as deeply chilling. On that evening, 3 middle-aged men walked onto the stage and introduced themselves to the panel as Ed Edwards. The host then read the biography of the real Ed Edwards. It was a fascinating, dramatic story. The host explained that Ed had once been an incredibly dangerous criminal, a man who had landed himself a spot on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list for a series of daring armed robberies and for impersonating a federal officer. But, the host continued, while Ed was serving a long sentence in a maximum security prison, a compassionate guard had taken him under his wing and helped him reform. Upon his release, Ed had dedicated his life to being a model citizen. He had written a best-selling book about his life and had become a highly sought-after motivational speaker, traveling the country to teach people how to spot con men and protect themselves from criminals. The celebrity judges began questioning the 3 men, trying to poke holes in their stories about prison life and criminal tactics. After the interrogation was over, the judges cast their votes. Finally, the host spoke the famous line, asking the real Ed Edwards to please stand up. A man in a sharp suit, with a warm, friendly smile and a perfectly groomed haircut, stood up. The crowd erupted into applause. He looked like the absolute definition of a wholesome, suburban American father. He looked like a man who could not hurt a fly. But, decades later, the world would learn the horrifying truth about the man who stood up on that stage. In the year 2009, a 40-year-old woman named April Balacio was lying in her bed, unable to sleep. April was Ed Edwards' daughter. And for her entire life, she had been haunted by a deep, dark suspicion about her father. Despite his public image as a reformed, peaceful family man, behind closed doors, Ed was an absolute monster. He was incredibly violent, physically abusive, and a pathological liar. April remembered that during her childhood in the 1970s and 80s, her father would suddenly force the family to pack up all their belongings in the middle of the night and move to a different state with absolutely no warning. Whenever April or her siblings asked why they had to keep running, Ed would claim that because he had been a police informant during his time in prison, old associates had discovered their address, and they were in imminent danger. April never believed him. She always felt that they were running from something far more sinister. So, on that night in 2009, April opened her laptop and decided to do some digging. She began making a list of all the random small towns they had briefly lived in during her childhood. She typed the name of each town into Google, followed by the words unsolved murder or unsolved mystery. As she scrolled through the search results, she stopped at a case from 1980. It was an unsolved double homicide in the town of Watertown, Wisconsin. April's heart began to race. She knew for a fact that her family had lived in Watertown in 1980 during the exact month of the murders. She read the details of the crime. A teenage couple, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, had disappeared from a wedding reception. Their bodies were found weeks later in a nearby field. They had been brutally murdered. The police had released a description of a suspicious man seen near the reception, and as April looked at the sketch, she realized it looked exactly like her father. April made a brave, agonizing decision. The next morning, she called the Watertown Police Department and told them she believed her father was responsible for the cold case. The police took her tip seriously. They tracked down Ed Edwards, who was now an old man, living in a trailer in Kentucky, and obtained a sample of his DNA. When the lab results came back, it was an absolute match. Ed Edwards' DNA was all over the evidence from the 1,980 crime scene. Ed was arrested and extradited to Wisconsin. Once he was in a small interrogation room, the facade of the reformed citizen completely shattered. He quickly confessed to the murders of Tim and Kelly. But then, he did something even more bizarre. He began demanding that the state execute him. He wanted the death penalty. When the prosecutors told him that Wisconsin did not have the death penalty and that his maximum sentence would be life in prison, Ed grew incredibly frustrated. He wanted control over his own death. So, to force their hand, he confessed to another double murder from 1,977 Inches, Ohio, where he had killed another young teenage couple, Billy Lavaco and Judy Straub. But due to a legal loophole, the Ohio charges still did not guarantee his execution. Outraged, Ed finally revealed a fifth murder. In 1996, he had murdered his own 25-year-old foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, in order to collect a massive life insurance payout. Because of the financial motive and the nature of the crime, this finally made him eligible for capital punishment. Ed was sentenced to death, just as he had wanted. However, he would die of natural causes in prison in 2011, just weeks before his scheduled execution. Since his death, cold case detectives and criminal investigators have realized that Ed Edwards was almost certainly one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Many experts believe he is responsible for dozens of unsolved murders across the country, spanning from the 1950s all the way to the 1990s. There is even a highly compelling theory, supported by some law enforcement officials, that Ed Edwards was the Zodiac Killer, the infamous unidentified monster who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s. If that theory is correct, it means that when Ed Edwards walked onto the stage of To Tell the Truth in October of 1972, he was not a reformed man who had put his past behind him. He was an active, cold-blooded serial killer. As he stood before the bright studio lights, smiling and waving to the cheering audience, he had already taken the lives of multiple innocent people. He had used a national television show to feed his massive ego, playing a game of lies in front of millions of viewers, while his victims lay buried in shallow graves across the country. These 5 stories, as different as they are, all share a deeply haunting common thread. They show us that the world is a far more mysterious, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying place than we dare to admit. They remind us that the stranger walking past us in a crowded store, the sudden urge that saves a life, the scientific institutions we trust, or even the smiling face on a classic television screen can hold secrets that defy explanation. So what do you think? Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Because the truth is, stories like these don't just exist on the internet. They happen in real life. Sometimes they happen a lot closer than we'd like to believe. Maybe don't watch it alone. Hundreds of years ago, in the dense forests and rolling hills of what we now call Richland County, Wisconsin, a young indigenous warrior was walking with purpose toward the center of his village. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a proud and resilient people who had called this beautiful land home for generations. The warrior was strong and brave, one of the best hunters in his tribe, and he had been summoned by his tribal chief. As he walked, the familiar sounds of village life surrounded him, but a sense of unease hung in the air. He had a strong suspicion about why the chief wanted to see him, and when he arrived at the village center, his fears were confirmed. Standing there with the chief were 9 of the other strongest and most capable men of the tribe. They stood quietly, their faces serious. The warrior knew immediately this was about the three missing boys. 2 days earlier, three teenagers from the village, boys on the cusp of manhood, had gone out into the wilds on a deer hunt. It was a rite of passage, a chance to prove their skills and contribute to the tribe. But they hadn't returned. 48 hours had passed, a full 2 suns had set, and there was still no sign of them. Their families were growing more and more frantic with each passing hour. They had pleaded with the tribal chief to send a search party, their voices filled with a desperate worry that was starting to infect the entire village. The chief had initially been hesitant. It wasn't completely out of the ordinary for hunting parties, even young ones, to be gone for a couple of days. The forest was vast, and a good hunt could take time. But the families insisted they had a bad feeling, a deep, gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after 2 full days of waiting, the chief agreed. It was time to act. And so, here was the young warrior standing before his chief and the 9 other men. The chief looked at him with trust and respect and asked him to lead the search effort. He would be in charge of this party of 10, responsible for finding the boys and bringing them home safely. In truth, the warrior felt it might be a bit of an overreaction. 10 of the tribe's best men for 3 teenagers who were probably just fine, maybe a little lost or extending their trip to seem more impressive. But he would never question the chief's command or disrespect the family's fear. He accepted the duty without hesitation. Of course, he would go. The 10 men gathered their supplies. They took their most reliable bows, quivers full of arrows, and sharp spears. They packed dried meat and skins filled with fresh water, not knowing how long the search might take. They said their goodbyes to the anxious villagers who had gathered to see them off. The air was heavy with hope and fear. Then, as one, the 10 warriors left the village, following the well-worn path that all hunters took when they ventured out into the great forest. The lead warrior was a master tracker. His eyes could read the forest floor like a storybook. Almost immediately, he picked up the trail of the 3 teenage boys. He could see their distinct footprints in the soft earth, and for a moment, he felt a wave of relief. This would be simple. They would follow the tracks, find the boys camped out somewhere, give them a stern lecture about worrying their families, and then guide them back to the village. It would all be over by nightfall. But as they followed the trail, the story the tracks told began to change. The footprints continued along the main path for a while, but then they suddenly veered off. They left the familiar trail and headed deep into a part of the forest that wasn't known for good hunting. This was the first thing that felt wrong. The Ho-Chunk people knew these woods intimately. They knew where the deer herds moved, where the best hunting grounds were. The path the boys had taken was leading them away from all of it. It made no sense. The lead warrior kept his growing concerns to himself, not wanting to alarm the others. He just kept his head down, focused on the tracks. They walked for miles, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. And as they walked, he noticed something else that was deeply unsettling. The tracks never stopped. There were no signs that the boys had paused to rest. There were no marks in the dirt to suggest they had stopped to set a snare or stood still to aim an arrow at a deer. Their footprints just went on and on in a straight, determined line as if they were on a mission marching towards some specific, unknown destination. After hours of relentless hiking, with the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky, the search party still hadn't found the boys. They found themselves standing at the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. As they looked down into the shadowy depths, they all realized they had traveled so far off the beaten path that they were now in truly uncharted territory. None of them, not even the most experienced hunters among them, had ever been to this place before. They had no idea what lay at the bottom of the ravine or what was beyond it. But they knew one thing for sure. The tracks of the 3 teenage boys led directly down the steep slope and into the ravine. There was no hesitation. They had to follow. So, carefully, the 10 warriors made their way down the treacherous incline. When they reached the bottom, the dense canopy of trees opened up into a small clearing. And there, right in front of them, was the dark, gaping mouth of a cave. The tracks led straight to it. They went into the blackness, but there were no tracks coming back out. For reasons they could not possibly understand, the three boys had hiked all this way into this unknown place and had walked into this cave. And they were, presumably, still inside. The warrior and his men approached the entrance cautiously, the air growing colder as they got closer. Even standing right at the mouth of the cave, they couldn't see anything. It was a void of absolute darkness. It was clearly large enough to walk into, but how far it went or where it led was a complete mystery. They called out the boys' names, but only the flat, dead echo of their own voices came back. A heavy sense of apprehension fell over the lead warrior. He didn't know this cave. He didn't know if the boys were hurt or lost, or if something else was in there with them. A bear, a mountain lion, or something worse. He had to be smart. He couldn't risk his whole team. He made a decision. He turned to two of his men and instructed them to go inside to scout it out. The other 7 men would wait with him at the entrance. The 2 chosen warriors nodded, and without a word, they stepped into the darkness and disappeared from sight. The 8 men waiting outside stood in total silence, listening. They could hear the voices of the 2 scouts echoing from within the cave as they called out the names of the missing teenagers. Their calls grew fainter and more distorted the deeper they went. From the outside, the group could only see the flickering light from the scouts' torches for a short distance before they seemed to be swallowed by the dark. Then, at the exact moment their light vanished, their voices stopped. The cave went completely, utterly silent. For 5 long minutes, the warrior and the others stood there, waiting, their anxiety growing with every passing second. What was happening in there? The silence was unnatural. 10 minutes went by. Then 15. Still, not a single sound came from the cave. It was as if the darkness had consumed the 2 men whole. The warrior couldn't wait any longer. He told the others to stay put and carefully stepped just inside the entrance of the cave himself. The air was frigid. He began calling out the names of the 2 men he had just sent in. His voice echoed through what felt like a vast empty space, but there was no reply. At least, not at first. Just as he was about to call out again, he heard something. It was a faint sound, coming from deep, deep within the cave. It sounded like a low, mournful wail. At first, he thought it was a single voice, but then it seemed to multiply, as if other voices were layering on top of each other, creating a strange, discordant harmony. And then, with a sudden, chilling realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a wail of pain, it was a chant. And it was a chant he knew all too well. It was the death song. It was the sacred, final chant a Ho-Chunk warrior sings only when he knows he is about to die. The moment the other 7 men outside heard it, they knew exactly what it was, too. They surged forward to the mouth of the cave, their faces masks of alarm. "We have to go in," one of them said. "They're in trouble." Something is wrong. Before the lead warrior could give an order, before he could form a plan, 6 of the 7 men charged into the cave. Their loyalty to their brothers overrode everything else. They ran headlong into the darkness, their own voices now echoing as they called out, chasing the sound of that terrible final song. The lead warrior and the 1 man who had stayed back with him stood frozen at the entrance, listening to the chaos. They heard the 6 men running and yelling, their sounds mixing with the haunting reverberation of the death song. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The chanting ceased. The yelling stopped. The cave was plunged back into that same profound, eerie silence. The lead warrior and the last remaining man were alone, their hearts pounding in their chests. They listened, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. Just quiet. And then it began again. The rhythmic chanting. The death song. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a couple of voices. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices, it seemed, all layered on top of each other, chanting the death song in a powerful rhythmic wave of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The sound poured out of the cave, a horrifying announcement of death on a scale he couldn't comprehend. At that moment, the lead warrior faced an impossible choice. Every part of his being, every rule of their warrior code, screamed at him to go in there, to fight for his men, to die with them if he had to. But another part of him, a logical, cold part, knew the truth. Something evil was happening inside that cave. If he and the last man went in, they would not come out. Their story would die with them. No one would ever know what happened. And so, in an act that went against every fiber of his soul, he made a decision. As the death song echoed all around them, he and the other man turned their backs on the cave and they ran. They ran for miles, not stopping, not looking back, fueled by terror and grief. They ran all the way back to their village, arriving long after nightfall, breathless and on the verge of collapse. They found the tribal chief and told him everything that had happened. The chief listened, his face grim. He declared that at first light they would all go back. The entire village. They would go back to that cave and they would get their people out. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest canopy, a massive group assembled. The tribal chief, the lead warrior, the other survivor, and nearly 100 other members of the tribe, men and women, banded together. They marched out into the wilderness, a somber and determined procession, retracing the steps back to the ravine, back to that cursed cave. When they arrived, the cave was just as they had left it. It was quiet. The tracks leading in were still there, undisturbed. There were still no tracks leading out. Everyone they had lost was still inside. But this time, they had a plan. The lead warrior didn't know how they could possibly succeed, but the chief was confident. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady. "We will not go in as small groups," he announced. "We will not be separated. We will go as one. We will lock hands, all of us, and form a great line. We will never let go of the person next to us. We will walk into that cave together, as one body, and we will find our people." It seemed like a brilliant idea. There was strength in their numbers, strength in their unity. Nothing could happen to them if they were all connected. So, the great human chain was formed. The warrior who had survived the previous day was placed at the very front of the line. The lead warrior was second, his hand gripping the first man's tightly. Behind him, stretching all the way out of the cave, was a line of nearly 100 people, all holding on to each other. When everyone was ready, they began to move forward, a single shuffling entity stepping into the cold darkness. They walked slowly, cautiously. After about 50 feet, the cave passage made a sharp turn to the right. As the front of the line rounded the corner, they were plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. No light from the entrance could reach this far. The lead warrior couldn't see a thing, not even his own hand in front of his face. All he could feel was the tight grip of the man in front of him and the man behind him. He squeezed their hands back, a silent promise that they were in this together. The man at the front of the line kept calling out the names of the lost, his voice swallowed by the immense blackness. As they shuffled deeper, the walls of the cave seemed to press in on them, the air growing thick and heavy. And then they heard it. From somewhere in the deep, the death song began again. It started low, a soft, rhythmic chant, but it grew steadily in volume and intensity until it was a booming, deafening chorus that echoed off the walls and vibrated in their chests. Panic began to ripple down the line, but there was nowhere to go. They were deep inside, trapped in the dark, with that horrible sound. The lead warrior held on as tightly as he could, trying to be an anchor of calm for the others. He tried to keep moving forward. But then, he felt it. The hand of the man in front of him, the leader of the line, suddenly went slack. It just slipped out of his grasp. The lead warrior lunged forward into the blackness, his hand grabbing at empty air. The man was gone. There was no scream, no sound of a fall, nothing. He had simply vanished. The lead warrior was now at the front of the line. He wanted to stop, to scream for everyone to turn back, but he felt a strange, irresistible force pulling him forward, deeper into the cave. It was a compulsion he couldn't fight. And then, to his absolute horror, he felt his own mouth open. He heard his own voice, completely against his will, join the terrible, chanting chorus of the death song. At that moment, chaos erupted. The human chain broke. People screamed in terror, letting go of each other, turning and scrambling blindly back towards where they thought the entrance was. It was a stampede of pure panic in the suffocating darkness. Minutes later, the survivors stumbled out of the cave, gasping and crying, blinking in the daylight. The tribal chief, who had remained outside, rushed to calm them. He quickly did a head count, and his heart sank. Over a dozen more people were gone. They had not come out. And the cave, which moments before had been filled with screams and the sound of the death song, was once again completely, unnervingly silent. The chief now knew, for certain, there was an evil spirit in that cave, something that fed on his people. He made a solemn declaration. No one from their tribe would ever step foot in that place again. They could not lose anyone else. The cave was not a place of mystery. It was a tomb. And so, they sealed it. They worked for hours, rolling massive boulders, piling rocks and dirt, until the entrance was completely blocked, hidden from the world forever. Centuries passed. The story of the cave that swallowed warriors was passed down from generation to generation. For the Ho-Chunk people, it became a legend, a terrifying campfire story to warn children about the dangers of the woods. Many who heard it wondered if it was real, or just folklore meant to scare them. They would never know for sure. Fast forward to the year 1930. A man named Paul Seafort, a well-known antique dealer in Richland County, Wisconsin, had a passion for hiking and history. He loved to explore the deep woods, searching for indigenous artifacts left behind by tribes like the Ho-Chunk Nation. One day, while hiking far off any established trail, he came across a secluded ravine. He climbed down, and on the far side, he noticed a strange pile of rocks. It looked unnatural, like a man-made mound, covered in moss and overgrown with grass. His curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and started pulling some of the rocks away. He quickly realized this was no random pile. These boulders had been placed here deliberately for a reason. After clearing away enough of them, he uncovered what they were hiding, the dark opening to a cave. He knew he had found something special. It took a lot more work, but he finally managed to create an opening just big enough to squeeze through. He was sure that a sealed cave like this must hold incredible artifacts inside. He went home and gathered supplies, including a strong lantern, and returned another day. He squeezed through the opening he'd made and entered the cave. He walked down the initial passage until he came to the sharp right turn. He followed it, and soon the ceiling began to get lower and lower, forcing him to crouch. He was so determined to see what was inside that he kept going. Even when the passage became so tight, he had to crawl on his belly, pushing the lantern ahead of him. Just as he was about to turn back, thinking it was a dead end, he slid under one last low-hanging rock, and the space suddenly opened up. He stood up and held his lantern high. He was in a massive, cathedral-like cavern. The beam of his lantern cut through the darkness, and what he saw made him freeze. The floor of the cavern was covered with human skeletons. But they weren't scattered about. They were arranged in dozens of neat, orderly rows. And they were all positioned in the exact same way, kneeling, with their arms stretched out over their heads as if they were bowing or praying in unison. There were so many of them he couldn't even begin to count them all. He stood there in stunned silence, his light trembling in his hand. He slowly moved the beam of the lantern in the direction that all the skeletons were facing. And there, at the far end of the cavern, he saw what they were all bowing to. Carved directly out of the stone wall of the cave was an enormous, imposing chair. A throne. And the throne was empty. The sight of those kneeling skeletons and that vacant throne filled Paul Seafort with a deep, primal fear. He forgot all about artifacts. He forgot about history. He just knew he had to get out. He turned and scrambled back through the narrow passage as fast as he could, not looking back, and fled the cave. He later told his incredible story to a journalist at the Milwaukee Journal, and it was published, creating a permanent record of his discovery. But the article, and Paul's account, left the world with two chilling, unanswered questions. What truly happened to all of those people inside that cave? And more importantly, who, or what, was sitting on that throne? We may never know what happened to those warriors inside the cave. But one question still remains. Who were all those skeletons bowing to? Until next time. On the damp, overcast evening of the 12th of August, 1944, a young American military pilot stepped out of his quarters at Royal Air Force Station Furstfield in Norfolk, England. The air carried the familiar chill of the British countryside, thick with moisture and the distant, low rumble of idling aircraft engines. The pilot, a handsome, athletic 29-year-old lieutenant, pulled a cigarette from his pocket, struck a match, and took a long, slow drag. The glow of the cherry illuminated his face for a brief second, revealing eyes that were tight with a mixture of intense anxiety and fierce determination. He needed the nicotine to steady his hands, which had begun to shake slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. He began walking across the tarmac toward a massive cavernous hangar on the far side of the base. Every step felt heavy, as if the ground itself were trying to hold him back. For weeks, he and his 35-year-old co-pilot, a fellow lieutenant nicknamed Bud, had been preparing for this exact night. They were the chosen crew for a highly classified Allied military initiative known as Operation Aphrodite. On paper, it was an innovative, cutting-edge tactical strategy designed to turn the tide of the war. In reality, among the handful of mechanics, engineers, and high-ranking officers who knew the details, it was widely considered a suicide mission. The young pilot, whose full name was Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., tried to push the grim reality out of his mind. He focused instead on the reason he was standing on British soil in the first place. Like thousands of his countrymen, he had joined the military to defeat Nazi Germany. By the summer of 1944, World War II had been raging for nearly 5 grueling years. The Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy on D-Day just 2 months prior, and the German army was undeniably losing ground. But a cornered beast is often the most dangerous, and Adolf Hitler's regime had grown increasingly desperate. To terrorize the British population and break their wartime resolve, Hitler had unleashed a terrifying new campaign of technological terror. He called them Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons. These were long-range, unmanned ballistic missiles and rockets, most notably the V-1 flying bombs, and the development of even larger underground artillery systems. Unlike traditional aerial bombing runs, these weapons were launched arbitrarily from heavily fortified positions across the English Channel in occupied France. They rained down indiscriminately on major civilian population centers, primarily London. By August, these vengeance weapons had already slaughtered over 5,000 British civilians, turning residential neighborhoods into smoking craters of debris and flesh. Right at that very moment, as Joe walked toward the hangar, Allied intelligence believed that the Germans had massed a devastating arsenal of these weapons at a massive, heavily fortified underground bunker complex in northern France. The site was aimed squarely at the heart of London, prepared to deliver a knockout blow that could kill tens of thousands more. The sole objective of Operation Aphrodite was to eliminate this catastrophic threat before it could be launched. Despite the staggering danger of the assignment, Joe had aggressively volunteered for it. It was a choice that baffled many of his fellow aviators. Joe was a seasoned patrol bomber pilot who had already flown his required quota of 25 combat missions. By all military regulations and traditions, his tour of duty was complete. He had earned the right to pack his bags, board a transport ship, and return home to the safety and comfort of his wealthy family in the United States. Instead, he had turned down the ticket home, actively seeking out a mission so hazardous that other pilots did everything in their power to avoid it. To understand why Joe Kennedy Jr. would make such a reckless gamble, one had to understand the family that raised him. Joe was the eldest son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a wildly successful, deeply influential, and fiercely ambitious American businessman and diplomat. Joe Sr. ruled his household with an iron fist and an unyielding philosophy. The Kennedys must always be the absolute best at everything they attempted. Failure was not tolerated, second place was viewed as an embarrassment, and an intense, relentless rivalry was actively nurtured among the children, particularly between Joe Jr. and his next youngest brother, John. From the day he was born, Joe Jr. was the undisputed golden boy of the family. He was the eldest, the tallest, the most conventionally athletic, and the one anointed by his father to fulfill the ultimate family legacy. Joe Sr. openly boasted to friends, politicians, and journalists that his eldest son was destined to become the first Catholic president of the United States. Joe Jr. embraced this destiny wholeheartedly, molding his entire life, education, and early political ambitions to match his father's grand design. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into the global conflict, and both Joe Jr. and his younger brother John, whom the family called Jack, enlisted in the military. Joe became a naval aviator, while Jack joined the Navy to command a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific Theater. For the first few years of the war, Joe's position as the favored son remained secure. But then, disaster struck Jack's boat, PT-109. In the dark of night, a Japanese destroyer rammed the small wooden vessel, cutting it in half and killing 2 crew members. Jack, despite suffering a severe, debilitating back injury in the collision, showed extraordinary courage. He swam for hours through shark-infested waters, towing a badly burned crewman by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth, ultimately leading his surviving men to safety on a deserted island. When the news of Jack's heroism reached the United States, it became a massive national media sensation. Jack was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal and the Purple Heart. His exploits were detailed in newspapers and magazines across the country. Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. In the Kennedy household, Jack was no longer just the skinny, sickly younger brother who lived in Joe's shadow. He was a certified, decorated American war hero. Joe Sr.'s attention shifted subtly but profoundly, praising Jack's bravery. For the first time in his life, Joe Jr. felt a deep, gnawing sense of insecurity. He felt as though he had fallen out of favor with his demanding father, replaced by his younger brother. The fierce sibling rivalry that had been baked into him since childhood flared up with painful intensity. Joe became consumed by a desperate, driving need to prove himself, to perform a feat of such undeniable heroism that it would eclipse Jack's medals and restore his status as the rightful heir to the family's political empire. When the call went out for volunteers for a top-secret, highly experimental, and immensely perilous mission in England, Joe saw his opportunity. He would become the hero who saved London. He would change the course of history. Joe flicked his cigarette butt onto the tarmac, watched the sparks scatter in the breeze, and pushed open the heavy personnel door of the hangar. The space inside was colossal, illuminated by harsh overhead industrial lights that cast long, dramatic shadows across the concrete floor. Positioned directly in the center of the hangar was a massive 4-engine heavy bomber, a consolidated B-24 Liberator. This was Joe's aircraft for the night. On the surface, the B-24 was incredibly familiar to him. He had spent the last 3 years logging hundreds of hours in the cockpits of Liberators, mastering their heavy controls, and understanding their aerodynamic quirks during dangerous anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic. But as Joe walked around this specific bomber to conduct his pre-flight inspection, he could see that this aircraft was radically different from any B-24 that had ever rolled off an assembly line. It was a bizarre, heavily modified anomaly, a one-of-a-kind experiment that felt profoundly unnatural to a trained pilot. The most jarring modification was the cockpit canopy. Normally, a B-24 cockpit was enclosed by a complex framework of heavy glass windows designed to protect the flight crew from the biting, sub-zero winds of high-altitude flight. On this plane, nearly all the glass had been entirely stripped away. The only piece remaining was a single solitary pane of safety glass directly in front of the pilot's seat, functioning exactly like the windshield of an open-top sports car. It was, essentially, a convertible heavy bomber. The mechanics had removed the glass for a very specific, unsettling reason. When the time came, Joe and Bud would need to evacuate the aircraft as quickly and seamlessly as possible. With no canopy in the way, they could simply stand up from their seats and throw themselves out into the rushing wind. Joe continued his walk around and noticed that all the defensive armaments had been stripped away. The heavy 5.0 caliber machine guns that normally bristled from the nose, tail, belly, and waist turrets were completely missing. In their place, the mechanics had installed wooden broomsticks, carefully carved and painted matte black to mimic the appearance of weapons from a distance. Removing the heavy guns, ammunition tracks, and hydraulic turrets saved thousands of pounds of weight. But the saved weight wasn't intended to make the plane fly faster or carry more fuel. It was done to accommodate the terrifying secret that lay hidden within the hollowed-out fuselage. The entire interior of the aircraft, the bomb bays, the radio compartment, the waist gunner stations had been completely packed with boxes upon boxes of a highly volatile, state-of-the-art military explosive called Torpex. Torpex was 50% more powerful than standard TNT. The mechanics had crammed exactly 21,170 pounds, nearly 11 tons of this explosive material into the belly of the plane. This B-24 was no longer a traditional bomber meant to fly to a target, drop its payload, and return home. It had been meticulously transformed into a giant, lumbering, piloted flying bomb. The concept of Operation Aphrodite was born out of technological frustration. The Nazi underground vengeance weapon bunkers were protected by dozens of feet of solid reinforced concrete and buried deep beneath natural hillsides. Standard Allied bombs simply bounced off the roofs or exploded harmlessly on the surface. The military theorists believed that the only way to crack these impenetrable fortresses was to crash an entire heavy bomber packed to maximum capacity with high explosives directly into the structures. Because the remote control technology of 1944 was incredibly primitive, it was impossible to safely take off a plane carrying 11 tons of explosives via radio control. A human crew was required to manually pilot the lethal drone off the runway, climb it through the turbulent lower atmosphere, and guide it to its cruising altitude over the English coast. Once the plane was safely airborne and on course, an accompanying mothership, a Ventura bomber flying closely behind, would engage a radio control link to take over the steering of the B-24 using experimental television cameras mounted in the drone's cockpit, monitor the instrument panel. Once the remote link was confirmed, Joe and Bud would arm the massive explosive payload, make a final radio confirmation, and immediately bail out over the English countryside, parachuting down to safety. The remote operator in the mothership would then guide the pilotless flying bomb across the English Channel and crash it directly into the German bunker in France. At approximately 5:55 p.m., Bud Willie walked into the hangar, carrying his parachute rig. He looked at Joe, and the two men shared a quiet, knowing nod. There was very little need for small talk. The sheer weight of what they were about to attempt hung heavily in the air. Both men were visibly sweating, their flight suits damp despite the cool evening air. They climbed up through the open belly hatch and squeezed into the cramped, stripped-down cockpit. Joe slid into the pilot's seat on the left, and Bud took his place on the right. After completing a frantic series of pre-flight checks, Joe received the final green light from the control tower. He reached forward and engaged the starter switches. One by one, the four massive Pratt & Whitney radial engines roared to life, coughing out plumes of blue-gray smoke before settling into a deafening, synchronized thrum that vibrated through the metal frame of the plane and deep into the bones of the two pilots. Joe looked out through the open sides of the cockpit down at the ground crew. The mechanics, engineers, and officers who had spent weeks working on the plane were standing in a loose line along the hangar walls. Not a single person was smiling. Their faces were grim, pale, and etched with an intense, somber reverence. They looked at Joe and Bud as if they were looking at ghosts, fully aware that the slightest spark, the smallest atmospheric bump, or a minor mechanical failure could instantly vaporize the aircraft and everyone within a mile radius. Sensing the palpable dread radiating from the ground crew, Joe forced a wide, confident grin across his face. He leaned out of the open cockpit, flashed a cheerful, theatrical wave, and gave a sharp thumbs up to the men below, performing the role of the fearless, unflappable leader he believed his father wanted him to be. But beneath the bravado, Joe's stomach was tied in knots. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He was terrified. By 5:59 p.m., Joe released the heavy toe brakes, and the massive, overweight B-24 began to roll forward, trundling out of the hangar and onto the taxiway. The true weight of the 11 tons of Torpex became immediately apparent. The aircraft felt incredibly sluggish and unresponsive, handling less like an airplane and more like a massive waterlogged barge. Every single seam, rivet, and metal plate in the fuselage creaked and groaned under the immense stress. Every minor bump and crack in the concrete runway caused the plane to lurch and bounce violently. Inside the cockpit, Joe and Bud held their breath with every shudder, painfully aware that they were sitting directly on top of a mountain of highly volatile explosives. Joe lined the heavy bomber up with the center line of the main runway. He took a deep breath, looked over at Bud, who gave a firm nod, and then pushed the quad throttles all the way forward to full power. The engine screamed in protest as the plane began its agonizingly slow acceleration down the strip. It used up almost the entirety of the runway, eating up thousands of feet of concrete as Joe fought the controls to keep it straight. Finally, just yards before the tarmac gave way to the grass fields at the edge of the base, Joe pulled back on the control yoke. The wings bit into the air, and the lumbering flying bomb reluctantly broke its connection with the earth, clawing its way up into the sky. As they gained altitude, Joe looked out of his open canopy and saw 6 other aircraft rising to join him. These were the escort planes, a mix of USAAF fighters to protect them from any rogue German Luftwaffe attacks, and the specialized Ventura motherships equipped with the top-secret radio control gear. The small armada formed a tight, protective echelon around Joe's B-24 as they leveled off at their designated cruising altitude of 2,000 feet. For the next 15 minutes, a surreal calm settled over the cockpit. The flight across the southern expanse of England was smooth and uneventful. The cold wind whipped fiercely through the open sides of the cockpit, tearing at their flight jackets and forcing them to communicate via their intercoms, but the engines ran perfectly. Joe watched the familiar rolling green patchwork quilt of the British countryside slip away beneath his wings. Ahead, the shimmering gray-blue expanse of the English Channel began to materialize on the horizon, glowing faintly under the setting evening sun. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching. The primary target for the mission was located roughly 120 miles south, situated just outside the small village of Mimoyex in the northernmost tip of France. Unknown to Joe and Bud, the entire premise of their dangerous journey was a catastrophic failure of military intelligence. 5 weeks earlier, on July 6, the British Royal Air Force had launched a massive conventional bombing raid against the Mimoyek site. Utilizing legendary Tallboy ground-penetrating bombs, 6-ton monsters designed to shake the earth like a localized earthquake, the British had successfully collapsed the underground galleries, destroyed the V-3 Vengeance supercannons, and permanently neutralized the entire facility. The German garrison had completely abandoned the ruins. There was no functioning threat to London left at Mimoyeks. The Reich's vengeance weapons at that location had already been neutralized, but because of a breakdown in Allied communication and photographic reconnaissance analysis, the American commanders had no idea Joe and Bud were flying a doomed mission to destroy a target that had already ceased to exist. At 6:15 p.m., as the plane cruised near the coastal village of Blythburgh, it was time to hand over control of the aircraft. Joe reached forward and toggled the heavy mechanical switch on his dashboard that engaged the remote control receiver. For a terrifying, agonizing second, the B-24 shuddered violently, its nose dipping sharply toward the earth as the automated internal gyroscopes fought for balance. Joe and Bud froze, their hands hovering over the manual controls, ready to grab them if the system failed. But within moments, the plane leveled out, tracking straight and true. A crackle of static echoed through Joe's headphones, followed by the calm, steady voice of the remote operator flying in the Ventura mothership just a few hundred yards away. The operator confirmed that the radio link was fully secure. He had complete control over the B-24's steering, altitude, and throttles. Joe slowly pulled his hands back from the yoke and removed his feet from the rudder pedals. The plane was flying itself. There were now only 2 final tasks left for Joe and Bud to perform before they could leap from the open cockpit and parachute safely into history. First, they had to manually arm the 11 tons of Torpex, transforming the passive cargo into a live, highly sensitive weapon that would detonate upon impact with the French hillside. Second, Joe had to transmit a highly specific, pre-arranged code word over the radio channel, Spade Flush. This code would signal to the entire escort fleet that the explosives were live, the mission was fully operational, and the crew was bailing out. Joe turned around completely in his pilot's seat, twisting his torso to face the auxiliary bulkhead panel located directly behind him. This panel contained the master arming assembly, a complex array of wires, fuses, and a heavy industrial toggle switch. Once this switch was flipped, a low-voltage electrical current would flow directly into the multiple detonators buried within the Torpex payload. It was the point of no return. Joe looked at the switch. His hand hovered just inches away from the cold metal lever. A wave of profound, suffocating dread washed over him. He knew with absolute certainty that what he was about to do was the most dangerous act of his entire life. The margin for error was non-existent. If something went wrong, there would be no warning, no time to react, and no survival. He thought of his father waiting across the Atlantic for news of a great victory. He thought of his brother Jack wearing his medals and absorbing the adulation of the family. Joe took a deep, shuddering breath, steeled his resolve, and reached out. He flipped the switch. Immediately, he grabbed his radio microphone, keyed the transmitter, and spoke the final words into the static, Spade Flush. What the brave crew of the flying bomb could never have known was that a catastrophic error had been made days prior during the frantic, hurried modification of the aircraft's electrical systems. A technician working in the cramped, dark belly of the plane had accidentally crossed a pair of crucial wires, insulation rubbed thin by the constant vibrations of the airframe. The arming system had been plagued by a fatal vulnerability to stray electromagnetic interference. The exact fraction of a second that Joe flipped the switch to live arm the system A stray radio signal, likely the powerful transmission from the nearby Ventura mothership trying to send a control command, crossed into the exposed wiring. Instead of merely preparing the fuses for a future impact detonation, the electrical current bypassed every safety mechanism and shot straight into the primary explosive train. The detonation was instantaneous. In a microsecond, the 11 tons of Torpex exploded with an apocalyptic fury that defied comprehension. The blast didn't merely break the B-24 apart, it completely vaporized it. A massive, blinding fireball erupted over the quiet village of Blytheburg, lighting up the twilight sky for dozens of miles in every direction. The shockwave was so violent that it severely damaged several of the escort planes flying hundreds of yards away, nearly knocking them out of the sky. On the ground below, the residents of Suffolk felt the earth shake as if struck by a massive earthquake. Over 3,000 homes in the surrounding countryside sustained damage, their windows shattered and roofs caved in by the sheer concussive force of the explosion. Debris from the aircraft, tiny, twisted fragments of aluminum and charred metal, rained down over a 3-mile radius, sizzling as it fell into the marshlands and fields. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. and Wilford Bud Willey were killed instantly, utterly obliterated in a flash of light before their brains could even register the failure. They never felt pain. They never had time to realize that their mission had failed. No recognizable remains of either man were ever recovered from the crash site. In the immediate aftermath, the tragic loss of the Aphrodite drone had absolutely zero impact on the progression or outcome of World War II. The war in Europe continued its relentless march toward Berlin, concluding 9 months later with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. The destruction of the empty, abandoned bunker at Mimoyex was quickly forgotten in the grand calculus of global conflict. But the catastrophic failure of that secret flight altered the course of American history in a profound, permanent, and staggering way. When the devastating news of Joe Jr.'s death reached the Kennedy family estate in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, it completely shattered Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. The grand, decades-long political strategy he had meticulously constructed for his family was instantly reduced to ash. His golden boy, the chosen son who was supposed to carry the Kennedy name all the way to the White House, was gone. But the patriarch's intense, unyielding ambition did not die with his eldest son. It merely shifted. With Joe Jr. gone, the crushing weight of the family's destiny fell squarely onto the shoulders of the second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Prior to the tragedy of 1944, Jack had absolutely no desire to enter the brutal, cutthroat world of American politics. He was a sickly young man who suffered from chronic health problems, and his true passions lay in literature, journalism, and history. He had planned to pursue a quiet, intellectual career as a writer or a university professor, content to live his life far away from the public eye while supporting his older brother's political campaigns. Years later, reflecting on the profound turning point of his life, John F. Kennedy would openly admit to close friends and associates, Joe was the star of our family. He was the one who was going to go into politics. If he were alive, I would have been a writer. I never would have run for office. But the family dynamics allowed for no vacuum. Spurred on by his grieving father's relentless pressure and a deep, solemn sense of duty to fulfill the legacy of his fallen brother, Jack reluctantly stepped into the political arena. He took Joe's place. In 1946, utilizing the same campaign apparatus and financial backing that had been originally built for his older brother, Jack ran for and won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. His political rise was meteoric, fueled by his charismatic personality, his genuine intellect, and his status as a highly decorated war hero, the very status that had inadvertently driven his older brother to volunteer for that fatal flight over England. By 1952, he was elected to the United States Senate. and in November of 1960, John F. Kennedy accomplished the impossible. He defeated Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history to become the 35th President of the United States. He became the first Catholic to ever hold the office, fulfilling the exact prophecy his father had spoken decades earlier. The ripple effects of that single mechanical malfunction in the cockpit of a B-24 bomber in 1944 fundamentally rewrote the narrative of the 20th century. Had those wires not been crossed, had Joe Kennedy Jr. safely bailed out of that plane, he would have returned home to become the political juggernaut of the family. John F. Kennedy would have remained a private citizen, a journalist covering the events of a world he wasn't shaping. Without the JFK presidency, the modern world would look entirely unrecognizable. A different leader would have sat in the Oval Office during the terrifying heights of the Cold War, facing down the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where a single miscalculation could have triggered a global thermonuclear holocaust. The trajectory of the civil rights movement, the early and fateful escalation of American involvement in the Vietnam War, and the grand, audacious political will required to launch the Apollo space program to land a man on the moon were all deeply, inextricably tied to the specific character, decisions, and rhetoric of John F. Kennedy. The entire global landscape was irrevocably reshaped because one night in 1944, an ambitious young pilot took a deep breath, reached out his hand in the dark, and flipped a switch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Obsession is a quiet, dangerous thing. It usually starts out harmlessly. Maybe it is a hobby you enjoy, a television show you love, or a dream you have been chasing since you were a kid. You think about it during your morning commute. You talk about it with your friends. But for some people, that interest slowly starts to twist. It becomes a hunger that cannot be satisfied by just thinking or talking. They need to feel it. They need to live it. They want to cross the invisible boundary that separates normal life from the darkest parts of human nature just to see what lies on the other side. And once that boundary is crossed, there is no going back. This is the story of a man who let his obsession drive him to build a real-life house of horrors, and the two unsuspecting men who walked right into it. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to look at a man named Mark Twitchell. Ever since he was a young boy growing up in Edmonton, Canada, Mark had one massive dream. He wanted to be a famous Hollywood filmmaker. He wanted his name to be known all over the world. But the problem was, Edmonton was not exactly a hotbed for the film industry. If you wanted to make movies, you usually had to go to Vancouver, Toronto, or down to Los Angeles. Mark did not do that. Instead, after high school, he decided to stay local. He enrolled in an Edmonton art college and graduated in the year 2000 with a degree in radio and television arts. He was convinced that this degree would be his ticket to stardom. But after graduation, reality set in. Mark made several short films, but none of them went anywhere. They were only watched by his close friends and supportive family members. For years, it seemed like his filmmaking career was going to be a complete dud. And so, it looked like Mark was destined for a quiet, unremarkable life. But then, in 2007, Mark had an unexpected breakthrough. He had been a massive Star Wars fan his entire life. He decided, purely as a passion project, to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished the script, he showed it to his colleagues. They were absolutely blown away. They told him that the writing was incredible and that he needed to actually produce it. Mark was amazed by this positive feedback. He decided to take a huge gamble and produce the film. He began reaching out to various actors to see if they would be interested in playing a role, Amazingly, his script found its way to Jeremy Bulloch, the actor who played the iconic character Boba Fett in the original trilogy. Jeremy was so impressed by Mark's script that he agreed to fly to Edmonton and play a role in the film. When the movie was completed, it did not turn Mark into an overnight Hollywood celebrity, but it did put him on the map. He was now seen as a legitimate professional filmmaker. It taught him a powerful lesson. He realized that if he wanted to make successful films, he had to focus on subjects he was deeply, obsessively passionate about. Fast forward to 2008, Mark was looking for his next big project. At this time, he was completely obsessed with a television show called Dexter. The show was about a fictional serial killer who worked for the police department by day and hunted down bad guys by night. The way this character killed his victims was highly specific and methodical. He would set up what he called a kill room. He would find an isolated space like an empty room or a garage and cover every single surface with plastic sheeting. The ceiling, the walls, and the floor were all taped up in thick plastic to catch any blood and physical evidence. Then he would kill his victim, dismember the body, wrap the remains in the plastic sheeting to leave no trace behind, and dump everything into the deep ocean. Mark watched this show obsessively. He decided that his next movie had to be about a serial killer. But he did not want it to be pure fiction. He wanted it to feel incredibly real. At the time, there were rumors circulating in Edmonton about an uncaught killer who was targeting people in the city. Mark decided that this mysterious Edmonton killer would be the star of his movie. Mark spent several weeks doing intense research on real-life killers, their victims, and how police investigated these cases. He wanted his script to be mathematically perfect. He wanted every action, every reaction, and every emotion to feel authentic. He sat down and wrote a 42-page draft of a script, but then something strange happened. This draft somehow got leaked. When the contents of the script were read by people in the industry, it caused an immediate wave of shock and concern. The script was so graphic, so detailed, and so disturbing that it eventually landed on the desks of the Edmonton Police Department. The police read the script and were deeply alarmed. They contacted Mark and told him in no uncertain terms that he could not make this movie. They basically tried to wipe the script from existence. Today, you can only find heavily censored versions of it. But if you look at the uncensored version, you realize that the story Mark wrote was not a work of fiction at all. It was a step-by-step record of actual events. And to understand what was really in that script, we have to look at the lives of the ordinary men who crossed paths with Mark. In early October of the year 2008, a 26-year-old man named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles was a gentle, soft-spoken guy who worked as a security guard at a local casino. He was a hard worker and a good friend, but his personal life had recently been completely shattered. A few months earlier, his wife had sat him down and told him that she did not love him anymore. She packed her bags and left. Giles was still deeply in love with her, and this sudden rejection broke his heart. He tried to stay busy with work, but whenever he came home to his empty apartment, the silence was deafening. He felt a heavy, suffocating loneliness every single day. Finally, on Friday, October 3rd, Giles decided that he could not live like this anymore. He needed to try and move on. He went online and created a profile on a popular local dating website. He started scrolling through the profiles of women in the Edmonton area, hoping to find someone he could connect with. At first, none of the profiles caught his eye. But then, he stopped on a profile of a woman named Sheena. She was a beautiful, young, blonde woman who lived right in Edmonton. Giles took a deep breath and sent her a polite message to introduce himself. To his surprise, she responded just a few minutes later. Over the next couple of hours, the two of them exchanged dozens of messages. They talked about their lives, their interests, and their plans. Giles felt a spark of hope that he had not felt in months. He was finally smiling again. Eventually, Sheena sent a message saying that since they lived so close to each other, they should meet up that very night for dinner and a movie. Giles was thrilled. He immediately replied and asked for her address so he could come pick her up. But the problem was, Sheena did not want to give him her address. She explained that she felt uncomfortable sharing her actual home address with a stranger on a dating website. Giles understood this. It made sense for a woman to be cautious when meeting a man online. Instead of an address, Sheena sent him a highly specific, customized set of directions. She told him to follow a route of well-known local landmarks in a suburban neighborhood of Edmonton. She said that when he reached the final landmark, he would see a detached two-car garage in an alleyway. She said that one of the garage doors would be partially open. Giles was instructed to walk under the open garage door, walk straight through the garage, go out the back door, cross the backyard, and meet her at the back steps of her house. This was definitely a strange way to meet someone, but Giles rationalized it. He figured she was just taking extra safety precautions. He agreed to the plan, freshened up, got dressed in his nice clothes, and got into his truck. Giles followed the landmarks perfectly. After about 15 minutes of driving, he turned into a quiet alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. He looked to his right and saw the detached garage. Just like Sheena had said, one of the garage doors was open, though it was only raised about halfway. He would have to duck down to get inside. Giles parked his truck and stepped out. He tried to look over the top of the garage to see the house behind it, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sheena waiting for him, but the garage was blocking his view. He thought about how close he was to finally starting a new chapter in his life. He walked over to the open garage door, bent down, and stepped inside. As soon as he stood up inside, he realized it was pitch black. There were no lights on. But there was some light spilling in from the alley behind him, and as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something incredibly bizarre. Virtually every single surface of the garage was covered in thick plastic sheeting. The walls, the ceiling, and the concrete floor were all wrapped in plastic. Giles had no idea why a garage would be set up like this. He thought maybe she was doing some home renovations or painting. He did not let it bother him. He focused on the door at the back of the garage that led to the yard. He walked across the plastic-covered floor, reached out, and put his hand on the doorknob. But before he could turn it, a blinding, agonizing pain shot through the back of his neck. Giles whipped around in shock. Standing in the darkness right in front of him was a massive man wearing a black and gold hockey mask. The man was holding a heavy stun baton. Before Giles could even comprehend what was happening, the masked man lunged forward and rammed the stun baton directly into Giles's stomach, pulling the trigger. The electrical current surged through Giles's body. He collapsed onto the plastic floor, his muscles locking up in agony. The attacker let go of the trigger, and Giles, driven by sheer survival instinct, scrambled to his feet and tried to run toward the exit. But when he turned around, he stopped, dead in his tracks. The masked man was blocking the only way out, and he was now holding a handgun, pointing it directly at Giles's head. The masked man barked at Giles to get on the ground and put his face down. Giles was completely terrified. He knew he was defenseless, so he complied. He lay down on his stomach on the cold plastic sheeting. The attacker walked over, pulled out a roll of heavy duct tape, and placed a thick strip of tape over Giles's eyes, blinding him. As Giles lay there in the dark, his mind began to race. He thought about his ex-wife. He thought about his parents and his friends. He realized with absolute horror that he had not told a single person where he was going tonight. If this man killed him right here, no one would ever know where to look. He would simply vanish off the face of the earth. Then he heard the metallic sound of chains or handcuffs being rattled nearby. Giles realized that if he allowed himself to be bound, he would never leave this garage alive. He decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die fighting. With a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline, Giles ripped the duct tape off his eyes, jumped to his feet, and faced his attacker. He yelled that he was not going to do this. The masked man was startled, but he quickly raised his gun. Giles lunged forward and grabbed the barrel of the weapon, twisting it away from his body. As soon as his hand touched the gun, he realized something incredible. The gun was made of lightweight plastic. It was a fake. This realization gave Giles a massive boost of confidence. He grabbed the attacker's arms and tried to trip him, but the masked man was much larger and stronger. The man delivered a brutal headbutt right to Giles's face. Giles fell to the ground, and the attacker jumped on top of him, raining down heavy punches and slamming his head against the concrete floor repeatedly. But Giles was so high on adrenaline that he barely felt the pain. He struggled wildly, twisting and turning, until he managed to wriggle out from under the giant. He scrambled toward the half-open garage door, but the attacker grabbed him by his jacket. Giles twisted his body, slipped right out of his jacket, and rolled under the garage door into the alley. He was free, but his legs suddenly felt like lead. The effect of the stun baton was finally catching up to him, and he collapsed onto the dirt. Before he could crawl away, the attacker's hand reached out from under the garage door, grabbed Giles by the ankle, and began dragging him back inside. Giles kicked wildly with his free leg, screaming for help at the top of his lungs. He managed to break the grip, got to his feet, and ran down the alleyway. He ran past his truck, too terrified to stop and look for his keys. He ran until he reached a paved walking path where he collapsed, exhausted and bleeding. Just then, he saw a young couple walking toward him. Giles pointed down the alleyway and screamed that a man was trying to kill him. But then, the masked man walked right out of the alley. He was still wearing the hockey mask, but he walked with a calm, casual stride. He walked right up to Giles and the couple. He did not look panicked at all. Instead, he chuckled and said that Giles was just making a big deal out of a harmless game. He called Giles by the name Frank and told him to stop messing around and come back to the garage. The couple looked at Giles, who was covered in dirt and blood, and then looked at the giant in the hockey mask. They were completely confused and terrified. They did not know if this was a robbery setup, a prank, or a domestic dispute. They told Giles that they did not want any part of this, and they walked away, leaving him completely alone with his attacker. Giles lay on the ground, watching the couple disappear. He looked back at the masked man, who turned around and walked back down the alley toward the garage. Giles realized this was his only chance. He waited a few moments, gathered all the strength he had left, and dragged himself back to his truck. He jumped inside, locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away. When he finally got back to his apartment, he was shaking with fear and adrenaline. But as the hours passed, another feeling washed over him. He felt incredibly embarrassed. He realized he had been completely fooled by a fake online dating profile. He had been lured into a trap by a lunatic. He convinced himself that since he had escaped, and since he did not actually know who the man was, there was no point in involving the police. He was ashamed, and so he decided to keep the entire terrifying ordeal a secret. He resolved to never speak of it again and try to move on with his life. But the problem was, the monster in the garage was not done. Exactly 1 week later, on Wednesday, October 8th, another Edmonton resident was looking for love online. Johnny Altinger was 38 years old and worked as a quality control inspector for an oil and gas company. It was a stable job, but Johnny did not particularly enjoy it. He was a tech enthusiast who loved spending his free time building computers and riding his prized motorcycle. He was a popular guy with a large circle of close friends, but he had always struggled to find a stable romantic relationship. That afternoon, Johnny decided to try his luck on the very same dating website that Giles had used. As he scrolled through the profiles, he came across a woman named Jen. She was a beautiful, young blonde who seemed incredibly friendly. Johnny sent her a message, and she replied almost instantly. The two of them hit it off immediately. They messaged back and forth for hours, laughing and sharing stories. Eventually, Jen suggested that they meet up that night for a date. But when Johnny asked for her address, she gave him the exact same excuse that Sheena had given Giles. She said she was paranoid about safety and did not want to give her address to a stranger. Instead, she sent him a highly specific set of directions based on local landmarks. She told him to drive to a suburban neighborhood, find a detached garage with a partially open door in an alleyway, and walk through it to the backyard. Johnny thought this was highly unusual, but he was excited about the date and did not want to ruin his chances. However, Johnny was a cautious man. Before he left his apartment, he took the email containing the strange directions and forwarded it to one of his best friends, a man named Bobby Woodard. Johnny attached a lighthearted note that said, in case he went missing tonight, this was where he was going. Then, he got into his car and drove off. The directions led Johnny to the exact same suburban alleyway and the exact same detached garage. When he arrived, he noticed that the lights inside the garage were on, and he could see the silhouette of someone moving around. Johnny checked his watch and realized he was about 15 minutes early. He figured Jen might be getting things ready, so he decided to walk over and introduce himself. As he approached the partially open garage door, the lights inside suddenly went out. Johnny paused, confused, but then walked up to the door, ducked down, and called out a greeting. The lights flickered back on. Inside, the garage was empty except for a table, and every single wall and ceiling was covered in plastic sheeting. Standing in the back of the room was a man Johnny did not recognize. The man did not have a mask on. He smiled warmly and introduced himself as Harry. He claimed he was a designer who rented the garage space from Jen. Harry told Johnny that Jen was running a little bit late and would be back in about 20 minutes. He suggested that Johnny drive around for a bit and come back then, and Harry would personally walk him up to the house. Johnny agreed, got back in his car, and drove away. 20 minutes later, Johnny returned to the alley. The lights in the garage were now off. Johnny assumed that Harry had left, which actually made him feel more comfortable, as he did not really want to deal with a strange designer. He parked his car, walked to the garage, ducked under the door, and stepped onto the plastic-covered floor. He began walking toward the back door that led to the yard. But before he could reach it, a massive blow struck him from behind, hitting him squarely in the back of the head. Johnny stumbled forward, his head spinning in pain. He raised his hands to protect himself and turned around. Through the shadows, he saw Harry standing there, holding a heavy metal pipe. Johnny began screaming for help, shouting for the police, but Harry did not stop. He swung the pipe again and again, striking Johnny repeatedly until Johnny collapsed onto the plastic sheeting covered in blood. As Johnny lay there, battered and weak, he looked up at Harry and pleaded for his life. He told Harry that he would give him all of his money, anything he wanted, if he would just let him go. Harry looked down at him, smiled, and asked if Johnny promised not to tell anyone if he let him go. But before Johnny could answer, Harry brought the metal pipe down hard on Johnny's face. Johnny, driven by pure survival instinct, managed to grab the end of the pipe, holding onto it with all of his remaining strength to prevent another blow. Harry grew frustrated that this man was still fighting back. He reached down to his hip, unsheathed a heavy hunting knife, and held the blade right in front of Johnny's eyes. Johnny froze in terror and let go of the pipe, begging for mercy. Harry pulled the knife back and plunged it deep into Johnny's stomach. Johnny let out a horrific scream. Harry then drove the knife into the side of Johnny's neck, holding it there until Johnny stopped moving and bled out onto the plastic. As Harry stood over the lifeless body of Johnny Altinger, he did not feel remorse. Instead, he felt a strange disappointment. He thought to himself that he should have played more psychological mind games with his victim before killing him, and he resolved to do that with his next target. Harry then proceeded to systematically dismember Johnny's body. He placed the remains into heavy plastic bags, rolled up all of the plastic sheeting from the walls and ceiling to trap any remaining forensic evidence, and loaded everything into the trunk of his car. A couple of days later, he drove to a nearby storm drain and dumped Johnny's body parts and the plastic down into the sewer system. But the problem was, Johnny Altinger was a man with a tight-knit group of friends who cared about him deeply. When Johnny did not show up for work the next day and did not answer any phone calls or text messages, his friends immediately knew something was wrong. They went to his apartment and found his prized motorcycle parked outside. Johnny would never leave his motorcycle behind if he was going somewhere. Then, some of his friends received very strange emails from Johnny's account. The email stated that he had met an incredible woman named Jen and that they had impulsively decided to pack their bags and go on a long vacation to Costa Rica together. The email said he would send for his things later. But his friends were highly suspicious. Johnny was a computer expert who wrote with flawless grammar, and these emails were littered with spelling mistakes and unusual phrasing. Furthermore, he would never just abandon his life and his friends for a stranger. At this point, Bobby Woodard remembered the email that from Johnny had forwarded to him on the night of his disappearance. He found the email with the highly specific landmark-based directions to the garage. Bobby immediately took this email to the Edmonton Police Department. The detectives recognized the gravity of the situation. They followed the exact landmark directions listed in the email, weaving through the suburban streets until they arrived at the detached garage in the alleyway. They ran the property records and discovered that the garage was being rented by a young local filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. The police contacted Mark, and he agreed to meet with them right away. He was incredibly polite, calm, and cooperative. He explained to the detectives that he was an independent filmmaker and that he had rented the garage to use as a set for a movie he was shooting. He even showed them his equipment and props, explaining that the movie was a horror film about a serial killer. He claimed he had never met anyone named Johnny Altinger. But then, the detectives made a highly suspicious discovery. They found Johnny's red passenger car parked on a residential street remarkably close to Mark Twitchell's residence. When they asked Mark about the vehicle, he had a very convenient story ready to go. He claimed that a few days earlier, an unknown man had approached him on the street out of nowhere and offered to sell him the car for an incredibly low price because he was moving out of the country immediately and needed quick cash. Mark claimed he bought the car on the spot with cash. The detectives did not buy this bizarre story for a single second. They immediately obtained search warrants for Mark's home, his vehicle, and the rented garage. Even though the garage had been thoroughly cleaned and scrubbed down, forensic investigators used specialized chemical sprays like luminol, and they found significant traces of human blood on the floor. But the most damning piece of evidence was found when digital forensic experts began analyzing Mark's personal laptop. Deep within the hard drive, examiners recovered a deleted 42-page document. The document was titled SK Confessions. The letters SK stood for serial killer. The document did not read like a normal movie script. It began with a chilling statement explaining that this was the real-life record of the author's progression into becoming an actual serial killer. As the detectives read through the pages, their jaws dropped. The document detailed step by step how the author had set up a garage with plastic sheeting to create a perfect kill room, just like the character in the television show Dexter. It described how the author used a fake female profile on a dating website to lure a man to the garage. It described the first victim, a casino security guard who had fought back with incredible strength, realized the gun was fake, slipped out of his jacket, and managed to escape down the alley. The document even detailed how the author had chased the man into the street and convinced a passing couple that it was all just a harmless game, calling the victim Frank. The police realized that this document was not a work of fiction. It was an incredibly detailed diary of real crimes. They immediately searched their databases for any reports of an assault matching this description, but they found nothing because Giles Tetreault had been too embarrassed to report it. However, they managed to track Giles down. When detectives sat him down and asked him about that night, Giles finally broke his silence and told them everything. His real-life experience matched the recovered document perfectly, down to the smallest detail. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The police realized that Mark Twitchell was not just a filmmaker writing about a killer. He had actually become the killer. He wanted to experience the act of murder firsthand so that he could write about it with absolute authenticity. He believed this twisted dedication to his craft would make his movie a masterpiece and launch his Hollywood career. Mark Twitchell was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. His trial in 2011 became one of the most highly publicized and sensational cases in Canadian history. During the trial, the prosecution presented the SK Confessions document as a literal step-by-step diary of Johnny Altinger's murder. Mark took the stand in his own defense. He tried to claim that the document was a clever mix of fact and fiction designed to generate publicity for his upcoming film. He admitted to killing Johnny Altinger, but claimed it was a tragic accident. He argued that Johnny had become angry and attacked him when he realized the date was a setup and that Mark had only defended himself, but the jury did not believe his lies. The overwhelming physical evidence, the plastic-lined room, the fake dating profiles, and the testimony of Giles Tetreault proved beyond any doubt that this was a cold, calculated, and highly premeditated murder. The jury found Mark Twitchell guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This case leaves a deep, lingering chill. It makes us realize how incredibly thin the line can be between imagination and real-world evil. Johnny Altinger was just an ordinary man looking for connection, and his life was brutally stolen by a man who valued fame and artistic authenticity over human life. But Johnny's final smart act of sending those directions to his friend ultimately brought down a monster and saved countless other innocent lives. And for Giles Tetreault, the survivor, the memory of that dark garage and the hand grabbing his ankle will always remain a haunting reminder of how close he came to vanishing forever. This case is a reminder that obsession doesn't always look dangerous until it crosses a line you can never come back from. Johnny didn't get a second chance. Giles barely did. If you want to dive deeper into stories like this, there's more waiting for you. Until next time.